The morning they decided to scrap the Falcon X9, nobody in that boardroom could have predicted that the quietest man in the building would be the one to stop them. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't an executive. He was a mechanic with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a lunchbox with his daughter's drawing taped to the inside lid. But Ethan Carter stood up in front of 23 suits and said 6 words that made the room go completely silent. That aircraft didn't fail on its own. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The Falcon X9 had been sitting in Hangar 7 for 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Ethan Carter knew that because he had walked past it almost every single morning since he started at Ironcrest Aviation, and every morning he did the same thing. He slowed down, glanced at it through the dirty hangar window, and kept moving. Not because it was interesting to look at, mostly because it sat at the exact angle where the early light came through the high ventilation slats, and hit the fuselage in a way that made the rust look almost amber, almost warm, like something that had once been genuinely alive. It was a stupid thing to notice. He knew that. He noticed it anyway. The Falcon X9 had been one of Ironcrest Aviation's flagship demonstration aircraft, a mid-range regional jet built to prove the company could compete with the European manufacturers eating their market share through the late 2000s and 10s. The aircraft had logged exactly 47 flight hours before it was grounded following what the official maintenance report described as a cascading hydraulic failure event with secondary avionics anomalies. Whatever that meant in actual English, the short version was the jet nearly fell out of the sky on a demonstration flight over Denver, and after that, nobody at Ironcrest wanted to touch it. The pilots who'd been aboard didn't talk about it publicly. The lead flight engineer who filed the incident report had left the company inside of 3 months, and the Falcon X9 had been rolled into Hangar 7 on a cold November morning 6 years ago and essentially forgotten. Officially, it was pending assessment. Unofficially, everyone at Ironcrest called it the ghost. Ethan was 32 years old and had been working at Ironcrest for 4 years, the last 2 as a Level 2 mechanic on the maintenance rotation for their active regional fleet. He was not a flashy man. He was not the kind of person who walked into rooms and commanded attention. He was slightly under 6 feet, had the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym membership he never used, and had developed a habit of speaking less than necessary because his daughter Chloe had recently started a phase where she asked approximately 47 questions per hour, and he was conserving verbal energy. He drove a 2011 Chevy Silverado with 190,000 miles on it, a crack running diagonally across the lower passenger corner of the windshield, and a pine tree air freshener that had stopped smelling like pine approximately 2 years ago, but which he kept there because Chloe had picked it out and said it made the truck smell like Christmas all the time, Daddy. He had not replaced it. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 years earlier from a brain aneurysm that announced itself on a random Tuesday afternoon while she was folding laundry. She was 30 years old. There had been no warning. There had been no dramatic hospital scene where they got to say everything important. She had been there in the morning, laughing at something stupid he said over coffee, and then by evening she was gone, and Ethan was sitting in a hospital hallway trying to figure out how to explain to a 6-year-old that her mother wasn't coming home. He did not talk about this at work. Not because he was ashamed, but because it was his and Chloe's, and he had no interest in making it a story people told about him. He had enough going on without being the guy everyone felt obligated to feel sorry for. The medical bills from Sarah's final days had taken 2 years to fully understand, and another year to begin actually paying. Their apartment, a 2-bedroom on the east side of Duluth, Minnesota, close enough to the airport that Chloe could identify aircraft by engine sound, which was either charming or slightly concerning depending on who you asked, cost more than it should for what it was, because everything cost more than it should, and Ethan's salary covered the essentials and left not much room for anything else. He had a babysitter named Mrs. Kowalski, who lived 2 floors down and charged him $40 a day and made Chloe soup when she was sick, and occasionally left extra portions outside Ethan's door with a post-it that just said, "Eat something, you look thin." He paid her on time every month and bought her a gift card to the garden center at Christmas because she mentioned once that she liked orchids. That was the structure of Ethan Carter's life. Small, careful, and built around one person's well-being above everything else. So when everything at Ironcrest Aviation started to shift, when the new CEO arrived and the budget meeting started and the axe began swinging, Ethan noticed. He noticed the way anyone noticed when the ground started moving beneath something they couldn't afford to lose. Victoria Hale arrived at Ironcrest Aviation on a Monday morning in March, and the company felt it the way a building feels a structural engineer's first visit, with a vague, specific dread. She was 30 years old. That was the first thing people said about her, not because her age was the most important thing, but because it was the most immediately disorienting. 30. Running an aviation company with 2,400 employees, 3 active maintenance facilities, and a stock price that had been quietly bleeding for 18 months. She had come from Mercer Capital Group, where she'd spent 5 years restructuring underperforming companies. Her record was efficient and fairly brutal. She'd cut costs, streamlined operations, sold off underperforming divisions, and in 3 out of 4 cases, stabilized the companies. In the 4th case, the company had been sold for parts, which the financial press described as a strategic dissolution, and which the 340 people who'd lost their jobs described in much less diplomatic terms. Ethan first saw her on the day she did her initial walkthrough of the facility. He was lying on a creeper under a Boeing 737-800, reconfiguring a landing gear sensor when he heard the click of heels on the hangar floor, a sound that did not belong in a hangar, and rolled out to check. She was moving through the space with a small group, 2 men in suits who were taking notes on tablets, the company's operations director, Jerry Marsh, who looked like he hadn't slept in several days, and a woman who appeared to be her personal assistant. Victoria Hale was, to be direct about it, intimidating in a way that was almost architectural. She moved like someone who had decided exactly where she was going and expected the environment to rearrange itself accordingly. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that cost money to look that controlled, wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and was carrying a manila folder that she kept referencing and then snapping shut like punctuation. She glanced at Ethan briefly, the way someone glances at a fire extinguisher, registering presence without interest, and kept moving. "What's the utilization rate on this bay?" she asked Marsh, not breaking stride. "About 73%, average across the... I want bay-by-bay data, not averages. Averages hide problems." She snapped the folder shut. "Get me the individual numbers by Thursday." Marsh nodded and typed something on his phone. Ethan watched them move through the hangar and disappear through the far door. Then he rolled back under the 737 and went back to work. Around him, 2 other mechanics had also stopped to watch. "She's going to cut half the department," said Danny Reyes, who was 26 and always catastrophizing. He was lying on his back under the adjacent aircraft, staring at the undercarriage above him like it contained answers. "She's going to cut something," said Marcus Webb, who was 51 and had worked at Ironcrest for 22 years and had seen 4 different CEOs come through. He was the kind of man who developed a philosophical relationship with corporate upheaval. "They always cut something. Questions what?" "My cousin worked at Westlake Air," Danny said. She came in, they lost 140 jobs in 60 days. "Your cousin always has a story," Marcus said. "His stories always come true." Ethan didn't say anything. He was running a torque check and needed to concentrate, but he was listening. The announcement about the Falcon X9 came 3 weeks later. It appeared in an internal memo distributed on a Friday afternoon, which was the corporate equivalent of taking out the trash, Ethan had learned. Things you didn't want people to react to in real time went out on Friday afternoons when most people were already mentally checked out for the weekend. The memo was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph explained that, after a comprehensive asset review, the Falcon X9 aircraft currently housed in Hangar 7 had been designated as non-recoverable and would be decommissioned and sold for salvage within the next 30 days. The second paragraph thanked employees for their understanding. Ethan read it on his phone during his lunch break, sitting in his truck with a sandwich Chloe had helped make that morning. Turkey and cheddar, a specific ratio of mustard that she took very seriously for a 9-year-old. He read the memo twice. Then he ate the sandwich slowly, thinking. The thing about the Falcon X9 was that Ethan had spent a lot of time over the past year doing something he'd never really done at any previous job. Reading. Specifically, reading maintenance records, incident reports, and technical documentation that had absolutely nothing to do with his assigned work. It had started by accident. He'd been cross-referencing a hydraulic system diagram for a different aircraft and pulled up the wrong file, the Falcon X9's original incident report from 6 years ago. He'd started reading it to confirm it was the wrong file, then kept reading because something in the language was off. Maintenance reports have a particular kind of writing: dry, technical, specific. When something goes wrong on an aircraft, the language used to describe it tends to be very precise, because precision matters when the FAA is reviewing your documentation and when lawyers are potentially involved. The Falcon X9's original incident report was precise in most places, but there were sections that felt slightly different. Not wrong exactly, just slightly off. Like someone who was speaking a language fluently, but not as their first language. Technically correct, but with a rhythm that didn't quite match. Ethan had gone back to it 4 times over the subsequent months, reading it against the secondary maintenance logs, the hydraulic system inspection records, and the avionics anomaly reports. And each time he came back, the thing he kept noticing got louder. The damage described in the official incident report didn't fully match the actual damage logged in the subsequent hangar inspections. It wasn't a huge discrepancy. It wasn't dramatic. But in aviation, small discrepancies mattered. Small discrepancies were where problems lived. He told himself 3 separate times that he was imagining it, that he was a level 2 mechanic reading documentation far outside his professional lane and seeing patterns that weren't there because that's what humans did. They saw patterns in noise. He'd told himself this convincingly enough each time that he'd moved on, but he hadn't deleted the files. And now they were going to scrap the aircraft. The boardroom at Ironcrest Aviation's headquarters was on the 4th floor of the main building, with a wall of windows facing the tarmac and the distant shape of the hangars visible below. It was the kind of room designed to project confidence. Long glass table, leather chairs, the company's logo embossed on one wall in brushed aluminum. Ethan had never been in it before. He'd requested the meeting through 3 different channels over 2 days, which was not how things were normally done, and which had caused a notable amount of friction with Jerry Marsh's office. The request had ultimately landed on the desk of Margaret Whitmore, a veteran board member who had been with Ironcrest for 14 years and who had a reputation for being methodical in a way that management occasionally found inconvenient. Margaret had authorized the meeting with a brief email that said only, "Give him 15 minutes. Put it on my calendar." Ethan arrived wearing his cleanest shirt, which was still a button-down flannel because he owned 3 of those and 2 t-shirts, and the one dress shirt he owned had a faint coffee stain on the cuff that he hadn't been able to fully remove, and carrying a manila folder containing 12 printed pages and a USB drive. He walked into the boardroom and found 7 people he didn't recognize. Jerry Marsh looking like he wanted to be somewhere else. Margaret Whitmore sitting to the right of the head of the table with a coffee cup and an expression of careful neutrality, and Victoria Hale at the head of the table looking at him the way someone looks at an appointment they forgot they made. "Mr. Carter," Victoria said, "you have 15 minutes. Please use them efficiently." Ethan pulled out the chair they'd left him, at the far end of the table, which he suspected was intentional, sat down, and opened the folder. The Falcon X9 is being decommissioned based on an assessment that concluded the aircraft sustained catastrophic hydraulic and avionics damage that makes restoration economically non-viable, he said. "I want to show you that the assessment was wrong." Silence. Someone at the table shifted in their chair. Another person glanced at their phone. "Mr. Carter," said a man on Victoria's left, Raymond Cole, the company's senior vice president of operations, silver-haired and polished in a way that made Ethan instinctively careful. "The assessment you're referring to was conducted by a certified aviation engineering firm. Are you suggesting their analysis was incorrect?" "I'm suggesting their analysis was based on documentation that doesn't accurately reflect the aircraft's actual condition." Cole smiled in a way that contained no warmth. "And what's your qualification for making that determination? I've read every document filed on that aircraft since it was grounded, both the official records and the subsequent hangar logs." Ethan slid the first page across to Margaret Whitmore because she was the only person in the room who'd looked at him like a person so far. The hydraulic failure described in the incident report would have produced a specific pattern of secondary damage to the landing gear actuation system. That damage isn't reflected in the hangar inspection logs, not at the level it should be. Maintenance logs can have discrepancies, Cole said. "Yes, but these discrepancies go one direction. Everything in the hangar log suggests less damage than the incident report claims, consistently, across 18 months of documentation." Victoria had not moved. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not dismissive exactly, but not engaged either. More like she was running some kind of internal probability calculation. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Give me 90 days to fully inspect the aircraft. If the damage is what the report claims, I'll tell you, and you scrap it. But if the damage is less, if the aircraft can be restored, Ironcrest has a demonstration-grade regional jet worth somewhere between $18 and $22 million. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which felt much longer. Then someone laughed. It started as a single person, one of the men Ethan didn't recognize, near the middle of the table. And then it spread, not into a room full of laughter, but into a collection of smaller sounds, smirks, exhaled breaths, the particular dismissive quality of people who consider themselves serious professionals encountering something they've categorized as not serious. Raymond Cole didn't laugh. He just looked at Ethan with that same empty smile. "Mr. Carter," he said patiently, "you're a level 2 mechanic. With all due respect to your dedication to—" "I'm aware of my title," Ethan said. He kept his voice even. "I'm not asking you to trust my resume. I'm asking you to look at the documentation and tell me where I'm wrong." He said it directly to Victoria. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the page Margaret had passed to her without acknowledging it. "We'll take it under advisement," she said, which was the corporate equivalent of a door closing quietly. Ethan gathered his folder and stood up. "One more thing," he said. He hadn't planned to say this. He said it anyway. "The aircraft isn't dead. Someone made it look dead. There's a difference." He left the room. In the elevator on his way down, his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the specific physical aftermath of doing something terrifying while appearing calm. He pressed them flat against his thighs and breathed through it. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Kowalski. "Chloe wants to know if you're coming home for dinner. She made a list of what she wants to tell you about her day. It's a long list." He typed back, "Tell her I'll be there. Save me something." He walked back to Hangar 7, changed into his work clothes, and started doing his actual job. The meeting should have ended there. In any rational version of events, Ethan Carter went back to his rotation, the Falcon X9 got rolled out to salvage, and nobody ever thought about it again. That was the logical conclusion. Ethan was not naive enough to think otherwise. But something happened on a Wednesday evening, 9 days after the meeting, that changed the trajectory of everything. Ethan was working late. Not unusual, because he sometimes picked up overtime on evening shifts when Mrs. Kowalski was available to stay with Chloe, and the extra money mattered. He was the only person in Hangar 7 when he went to grab a diagnostic tool he'd left near the east wall, and he passed close enough to the Falcon X9 to notice something. The access panel on the portside avionics bay was not fully closed. He stopped. He knew the hangar maintenance schedule. He'd checked it that morning because he needed to know if anyone else was going to be using the space. Nothing had been scheduled on the Ghost for weeks. He stood there for a moment, looking at the panel. Then he climbed up the maintenance steps, opened the panel fully, and looked inside. He wasn't an avionics specialist. He didn't have the credentials to make formal assessments of what he was looking at. But he had 4 years of maintenance experience, a very good visual memory, and the photographs he'd taken of the aircraft's documentation 6 months ago when he'd first started pulling files. Something had been moved. Not broken. Moved. A component in the upper left section of the avionics bay was positioned differently than it appeared in the photographs. Slightly, but differently. Ethan climbed down, walked back to his bag, got his phone, and took 17 photographs of the avionics bay from as many angles as he could manage. Then he closed the panel, locked it. It had a lock, which he confirmed was functional, and sat on the floor of the hangar for about 3 minutes thinking. Someone had been inside this aircraft. Recently. And whatever they'd done in there, they'd done it quietly enough that nobody in the facility had noticed or reported it. He did not go to Jerry Marsh. He did not file an internal report. He drove home, made dinner for Chloe. Pasta with the specific sauce recipe she preferred. The one that had taken him 2 months to get right after Sarah died because Chloe had said, very quietly, "It doesn't taste the same, Daddy." And he'd taken that information and worked on it until it was as close as he could get. And after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and started looking more carefully at everything he'd collected. By 2 in the morning, he had assembled a picture that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The maintenance records on the Falcon X9 hadn't just drifted into inaccuracy through normal human error. The inaccuracies were too consistent, too directional. Someone with access to Ironcrest's internal documentation systems had edited records across an 18-month period in ways designed to make a salvageable aircraft look like a total loss. And whatever had just been moved in that avionics bay, Ethan wasn't certain yet, but he was developing a very specific and very bad theory about what it might be and what it might connect to. He closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and stood by Chloe's doorway for a moment. She was asleep on her side with one arm around the stuffed bear she'd had since she was 3. She breathed with the easy, uncomplicated depth of a child who still trusted the world. Ethan Carter, who no longer trusted the world particularly, but who had a very specific relationship with its mechanical systems, went to bed. He did not sleep well. Over the following 2 weeks, Ethan operated like someone dismantling a bomb in the dark. Carefully, slowly, and with the consistent awareness that any wrong move ended everything. He started accessing Ironcrest's internal archiving system during off hours, pulling documentation layers that weren't part of the standard maintenance workflow. He wasn't a hacker. He wasn't doing anything technically illegal. He had legitimate system access as part of his maintenance certification. He was just pulling files that nobody had pulled in years, cross-referencing logs that weren't supposed to need cross-referencing, and building a picture of what had actually happened to the Falcon X9 over 6 years of official neglect. The picture was getting clearer and worse simultaneously. In the avionics bay, he identified the component that had been moved, a secondary communications routing module that in its current position was not connected to any active aircraft system, but was physically integrated with the aircraft's primary power architecture in a way that had no legitimate purpose Ethan could identify. He photographed it. He measured it. He looked up the manufacturer's serial number, which required an hour of searching through technical databases before he found a supplier registry that matched. The component had not been manufactured for Ironcrest Aviation. It had been manufactured for a company called Vantage Aerosystems, a mid-sized aviation technology company that had been quietly acquiring contracts in the regional jet market over the past 3 years. A company that, if Ethan was reading the aviation industry trade publications correctly, stood to gain significant market advantage if Ironcrest Aviation stock continued its current decline. He sat with that information for a full day before he let himself take it seriously. Because the alternative, that someone inside Ironcrest Aviation was actively working with a competitor to undermine the company's value and had used the Falcon X9 as part of that operation, was not a minor professional grievance he was blowing out of proportion. That was a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes. And Ethan was a level 2 mechanic who drove a cracked windshield truck and whose most recent significant interaction with the company's leadership had ended with him being smiled at by Raymond Cole. He needed someone to bring this to who had both the authority to act on it and a reason to believe him. He thought about Victoria Hale. But Victoria Hale had looked at him in that boardroom like he was a problem to be efficiently managed. He wasn't sure she'd hear him now without more than he had. He thought about Margaret Whitmore, who'd authorized the meeting and who'd passed his documentation to the CEO without being asked. He pulled up her professional history. 14 years on the Ironcrest board, former aviation safety regulator. 2 years on an FAA advisory committee. Someone who'd spent time in aviation safety regulation understood that small inconsistencies in documentation weren't noise. He sent a short email requesting a brief meeting. He said only that he had found additional documentation related to the Falcon X9 that he believed the board should be aware of. The response came 4 hours later. Tuesday evening, 7 p.m., not at the office. I'll send you the address. The parking garage was downtown, 8 blocks from the Ironcrest Aviation headquarters. It was one of those 1970s-era structures with the water-stained concrete pillars and the fluorescent lights that always had one panel doing something slightly wrong. The kind of place that existed functionally, but generated no strong feelings about its own existence. Margaret Whitmore was standing near a pillar on the second level, wearing a dark coat and looking, Ethan thought, like someone who had thought carefully about whether to be here and had concluded yes, but without enthusiasm. She was 63, with silver hair cut practically short and the posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where posture communicated authority. Up close, she looked more tired than she had in the boardroom. "Mr. Carter," she said. Not warm exactly, but not the same quality of distance Victoria Hale had in the boardroom. More like, careful, watching him assess. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "I'm going to be honest with you." She didn't move from her spot by the pillar. "I debated this meeting for 2 days. I want you to understand what I'm risking by being here." "I understand." "I don't think you do, fully. So let me be explicit." She crossed her arms. "If what you're suggesting is accurate, there are people at Ironcrest with significant motivation to make problems disappear quietly. I've been on this board long enough to know what quietly looks like, when companies have something to hide. It is not gentle." "What changed your mind?" Ethan asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because 6 years ago, I voted to accept the engineering firm's assessment of the Falcon X9 without requesting independent verification. That decision was fast, it was convenient, and I have thought about it occasionally since." She paused. "The fact that a Level 2 mechanic found inconsistencies I didn't look for is either a coincidence or it isn't." She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced an envelope. "This is a copy of a confidential board document," she said. "Specifically, the internal post-incident review from a flight anomaly that occurred on a different Ironcrest aircraft 8 years ago, a cargo freighter, tail number 1C304. The incident was classified internally as a maintenance-related hydraulic failure." She held it out. Ethan took it. "Read page 3, she said. He opened the envelope, unfolded the document, found page 3. The language was technical, but the substance was clear enough once you knew what to look for. The hydraulic failure on IC304 had produced documentation inconsistencies in the post-incident maintenance records that followed a pattern, the same directional bias Ethan had identified in the Falcon X9's records. Less damage consistently reported than the incident data supported. "The IC304 incident was 8 years ago," Margaret said. "The aircraft was repaired, returned to service, and eventually retired. No further anomalies. The documentation inconsistencies were attributed to administrative error." "But they weren't administrative error." "I don't know what they were," she said carefully. "I know they resemble what you've described in the Falcon X9's records. That resemblance concerns me." "The same person," Ethan said. "I have no evidence of that." "But it's what you think." She didn't confirm or deny that. "What I think is that you need to be extremely careful. If you're right, whoever is responsible has had years and multiple operations to become comfortable doing this. They will not react well to exposure." She paused. "And Mr. Carter, they're already aware you're looking." That landed. "The anonymous complaints," he said. He'd received the first one 3 days earlier, a formal notification from Ironcrest's internal compliance office that an anonymous report had alleged he'd been accessing restricted maintenance files outside his authorization level. 2 complaints have been filed," Margaret confirmed. "The second one arrived this afternoon." Ethan stood with that for a moment. "So what do I do?" he asked. "Officially?" "Nothing. Officially, you should probably stop pursuing this." She looked at him steadily. "But unofficially, if you continue, you need documentation that exists outside Ironcrest servers, physical copies, stored somewhere that isn't your work computer or your personal email." She glanced at the envelope in his hand. "You should also know that Victoria Hale is not the enemy here. She doesn't know what she walked into. She came to restructure a company that someone has been systematically hollowing out." She paused. "She's made decisions with bad information. That's different from being part of the problem." "But she'll shut me down." "She will if you approach her as an opponent. She might not if you approach her with something she can't dismiss." She buttoned her coat. "Get me something concrete, not theory, evidence, and be careful in that hangar." She walked toward the stairwell without looking back. Ethan stood in the parking garage with the envelope and the specific feeling of a man who has just voluntarily walked much further into something difficult than he originally intended. He drove home. He checked the locks on the apartment door twice. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the printed documents and his photographs and started building a case. From the other end of the apartment, very faintly, he could hear Chloe's sound machine, the one that played ocean sounds and had the tiny crack in the corner from the time she'd dropped it, and which still worked fine despite the crack. He worked until 3 in the morning. Then he folded everything into a physical folder, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote a name and address on the outside that wasn't his own. He'd mail it in the morning from a post office 3 miles from the apartment, not the one he normally used. The suspension came on a Thursday. Ethan was in the middle of a standard inspection when Jerry Marsh appeared in Hangar 7 with 2 people from HR and the particular expression of a man who'd been given instructions he didn't personally enjoy carrying out. Ethan. He stopped a few feet away. We need to talk. The 2 HR representatives stood at a respectful distance and didn't look directly at anyone, which was a skill Ethan supposed HR departments taught specifically for moments like this. Okay, Ethan said. He set down his inspection tool. The compliance office has reviewed the 2 anonymous reports submitted regarding your file access activities. Based on their findings, we're placing you on administrative suspension pending a formal review, effective immediately. Ethan nodded slowly. How long? The review timeline is typically 2 to 3 weeks, but Marsh paused. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. Ethan, look. Between us. The complaints are formal. Victoria Hale has reviewed them personally. I can't do anything to move this faster. I understand. Is there anything you want to tell me? Anything I can document that might help your case? Ethan looked at Jerry Marsh, who was a decent enough man operating inside a system that was currently being operated against him. No, he said. I'll wait for the review. He packed up his personal tools, the ones he'd bought himself that he kept in a separate bag from the company's equipment. He walked out of Hangar 7 without looking back at the ghost. He drove to Chloe's school, parked in the lot, and sat in the truck for a while. He thought about the rent, which was due in 2 weeks. He thought about the medical bill installment plan, which had a payment scheduled at the end of the month. He thought about the fact that he had $640 in his checking account and a suspended paycheck. He thought about Sarah, which he tried not to do when he was already in a difficult moment because it compounded things in a direction that wasn't useful. But he thought about her anyway, specifically about the conversation they'd had once, early in their relationship, when he'd been frustrated about something at his previous job and she'd said, Ethan, you always figure it out. That's not optimism. That's data. You have a pattern. He had a pattern. He picked up Chloe from school. She came running out in her purple coat with her backpack bouncing and her hair slightly escaped from whatever he'd tried to do with it that morning. Dad, are you early? Little bit, he said. How was school? Okay. Mr. Haddad said my science project is very professional. She paused thoughtfully. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. It feels like one, but adults sometimes say professional when they mean something else. It's a compliment, Ethan said. Good. Also, I need to tell you 17 things that happened today. 17. At least 17, possibly more. Get in the truck, he said. Tell me all of them. She talked for the entire drive home. He listened. By the time they pulled into the parking lot, he had a plan. The thing about being suspended is that it creates time. Ethan had time he normally didn't have. Evenings, full days, stretches of hours that were suddenly unscheduled. He used some of that time to take Chloe to the library, to fix the kitchen faucet that had been slowly getting worse for 2 months, to finally organize the closet that had been accumulating things since Sarah died. He used the rest of it to build his case. Not the kind of case he'd been building before. Theory and inconsistencies and pattern recognition. Concrete evidence. The kind that didn't require the observer to trust his judgment or fill in gaps. He had already identified the secondary communications routing module in the Falcon X9's avionics bay. What he needed now was to establish provenance, to trace that component from its manufacturer through whatever pathway it had taken to end up inside an Ironcrest aircraft. He couldn't access Ironcrest Systems anymore, but Vantage Aerosystems was a publicly registered company. Their FAA manufacturing certifications were public record. Their supplier relationships partially visible through public procurement filings and aviation industry registries that anyone with patience and internet access could navigate. Ethan navigated them. He also made 3 phone calls. One to a retired aviation systems technician he'd once worked beside at a previous job who confirmed that the component Ethan described had a specific installation signature that was inconsistent with factory-authorized maintenance procedures. One to a Duluth attorney named Patricia Okonkwo who handled whistleblower cases and who, after listening to Ethan's summary for 45 minutes, said, "If half of what you're describing is documented, this is federal territory. You need to talk to the FAA's Office of Inspector General." And one to Margaret Whitmore, who listened without interrupting and said at the end, Do you have photographs? 71, Ethan said. A pause. 71 is good, Margaret said. He also had two loyal allies he hadn't fully appreciated until now. Marcus Webb, who had 22 years at Ironcrest and a fundamental aversion to being told things that weren't true, had quietly informed Ethan that he was willing to assist with whatever restoration work needed doing on evenings and weekends. He phrased this by coming to Ethan's apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, knocking on the door, and saying, "I looked at the documentation you'd filed. The inconsistencies you identified are real. I should have noticed them years ago and I didn't. What do you need?" Danny Reyes, who had the catastrophizing personality, but also the specific fearlessness of someone who'd grown up in a family of union organizers and who genuinely believed in the concept of the right thing, showed up 2 hours later. He said nothing about the suspension except, "This is messed up and I want to help." Ethan looked at the two of them in his kitchen, Marcus with a coffee cup and Danny with the slightly anxious energy of someone who expected something dramatic to happen soon, and thought, "Okay, here's what we're going to do," he said. They started with the documentation package. Ethan had compiled everything into a structured report, 71 photographs, timeline analysis of the maintenance record discrepancies, component identification documentation, the supplier provenance research, and a parallel analysis of the IC3004 incident from 8 years ago, drawing the pattern comparison. He formatted it like a technical safety report because that's what it was. And because if it ever ended up in front of federal investigators, he wanted it to look like work that had been done carefully. He sent copies to 3 places: the FAA's Office of Inspector General through their official whistleblower portal, Patricia Okonkwo's law office, and a secure external server he'd set up with help from a college friend who worked in IT security. Then he waited 48 hours for the suspension to resolve. It did not resolve. What happened instead was that the anonymous complaint was supplemented with additional documentation, not complaints this time, but a formal allegation from Ironcrest's legal department claiming that Ethan had violated FAA safety regulations by accessing and modifying aircraft documentation outside his maintenance authorization. He had not modified anything. He had read files, pulled reports, and taken photographs of an aircraft that sat in a hangar where he had legitimate access. But the allegation was now formal and official, and it was serious enough that it triggered an automatic extended review process that pushed his suspension from 2 or 3 weeks to indefinite. He called Patricia Okonkwo. "This is what retaliation looks like," she said. "It's also what desperation looks like. They're trying to discredit you before whatever you've filed reaches people who'll act on it. How long? Federal investigations don't move fast, but whistleblower protections are real and they apply here. Don't do anything that gives them legitimate cause. Pay your bills, show up when asked, keep documentation of every contact they make with you. I'm 2 weeks from not being able to pay rent." A pause. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's real, and I'm not dismissing it. Do you have family?" "No." "Friends?" He thought about Marcus and Danny, who were currently disassembling and cataloging the Falcon X9's hydraulic system on their own time in Hangar 7. He thought about Mrs. Kowalski, who had quietly reduced her daily rate to $20 without being asked when she figured out what was happening. "Some," he said. "The retaliation documentation actually helps your case significantly. I want you to forward me everything they send." He did. That night, after Chloe was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the $640 in his account ticking down in his mind like something with a limited fuel supply, and he made a decision. He was going to finish what he started. Not because he'd calculated that it would work out. He had no certainty about that. He was going to finish it because the alternative was to accept that someone had built a false version of the aircraft's history, and that version was going to stand. And Ethan Carter had a very specific problem with false versions of things. He'd learned it from Sarah, who had a saying she'd stolen from somewhere and made her own. The record matters. If the record's wrong, fix it. He was going to fix it. The 3 of them worked on the Falcon X9 for 3.5 weeks. Ethan technically had no clearance to be at the facility during his suspension, which was a problem they solved by Marcus and Danny running the on-site work, while Ethan provided guidance remotely during the day, and, with the specific assistance of a security badge that had not yet been deactivated, and a building access system that updated more slowly than policy intended, worked alongside them on 3 evenings a week. He was aware this was a risk. He took it. The restoration work was harder than he'd initially estimated, which was partly because the aircraft had genuinely been neglected for 6 years, not catastrophically, but in the accumulative way of systems that haven't been run, seals that have dried and cracked, sensors that had gone from dormant to dead, and partly because someone had introduced subtle damage at strategic points designed to look like the consequence of time rather than intervention. That was, in a dark way, impressive. Whoever had done this, and Ethan was increasingly certain he knew who, had understood aviation systems well enough to damage them in ways that were plausible. A hydraulic fitting just slightly below spec, a fuel system sensor connection that looked corroded but was corroded in the wrong direction given the storage conditions. Individually, each item could be explained. Together, they formed an argument. Marcus was the one who first put into words what they were collectively thinking on a cold Tuesday evening when they'd been working for 4 hours and the hangar had settled into the specific quiet of deep night. Someone who did this, he said, not looking up from the fitting he was examining, knew what they were doing. Yes, Ethan said, not a technician, an engineer, or someone who spent significant time with engineers. Yes, Marcus turned the fitting over in his hand. Raymond Cole's previous position was VP of Technical Operations at a company called Stratton Aero. Before that, he had a degree in aerospace engineering. Ethan looked at him. I have time in the evenings, Marcus said simply. I research things. Danny, who was lying on his back on a portable light dolly he'd repurposed into a flat creeper, raised his hand slightly. I also looked him up. His LinkedIn used to list a consulting relationship with Vantage Aero Systems. He took it down sometime in the last 2 years, but Internet Archive caught it. Ethan sat with this. That's not evidence, he said. No, Marcus agreed. But it's direction. It was direction. They went back to work. The engines turned over for the first time on a Wednesday night in early October. It wasn't planned as a milestone. They'd been working through the fuel system, and Ethan had made a judgment call to run a preliminary power test with the APU, the auxiliary power unit, just to check the electrical systems they'd restored. Marcus had run the checklist. Danny had been outside managing the fire suppression access point as a precaution. The APU came online clean. Then on instinct more than plan, Ethan had moved the engine start sequence through the first stages. Just to listen. Just to feel what the systems were telling him. The left engine turned, caught, then the right. The sound filled the hangar like a voice that had been waiting 6 years to speak. It was not a perfect sound. There were elements in the engine note that told him the turbine blades needed attention, that the fuel mixture was running slightly rich, that there were 6 more weeks of work before anything approaching an airworthiness certificate was realistic. But it was the right sound, the fundamental sound. The aircraft was alive. Marcus was standing near the tail section. From where Ethan was in the cockpit, he could see Marcus through the windscreen. The older mechanic had his hands in his pockets. He was looking at the engines with the expression of a man who had believed something privately for a long time and had just been proven right in front of witnesses. Danny's voice came over the radio. Did you just start the engines? Yeah, Ethan said. A pause. Does it sound okay? Ethan listened to the engines for another moment. It sounds alive, he said. He brought the engines back to idle and then off. The hangar returned to silence. He sat in the cockpit in the dark for a moment, not thinking about the investigation or the suspension or the $640 that had become $312, just sitting in the returned quiet of a place that had been empty for 6 years. Then he climbed down, and the 3 of them sat on the hangar floor with bad coffee from a thermos Danny had brought and said very little for a while. We're not done, Marcus said eventually. No, Ethan agreed. But it's different now. It was different now. He drove home at 2 a.m, careful on the quiet roads, and let himself into the apartment. He stood in Chloe's doorway for a minute. She was asleep with the bear and the ocean sounds, and felt something he hadn't felt in several weeks. Not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than hope, the functional conviction that continuing was correct. That was enough for tonight. He'd been back at his truck for 30 seconds when he noticed that the folder he kept in the cab, the backup physical copy of his documentation, the one he carried everywhere because the paranoia had become habit, had been moved. Not taken. Moved. He knew where he'd left it, and it was 2 inches from where it should have been. He sat in the truck in the parking lot of Ironcrest Aviation at 2:15 in the morning and understood very clearly that someone had been in his vehicle. He started the engine and drove home without stopping. He checked the apartment locks 3 times. Then he called Marcus from the kitchen table because Marcus had given him a number specifically for situations like this and said, "Someone searched my truck tonight." Marcus's voice was flat and awake despite the hour. "Were you followed home?" "I don't know. I don't think so." "Assume you were. Is anything missing from the truck?" "No, nothing was taken, just moved." "A message," Marcus said. "Or they photographed it." "Or that." A pause. "Are the physical copies all accounted for?" "Everything important is at the lawyer's office and the external server. The truck copy was a duplicate." "Good. Get some sleep. We're close, Ethan. That's why they're pushing." He was right. They were close, and something was pushing back. $312 lasted 9 days. On the 10th day, Ethan transferred $40 to Mrs. Kowalski's account for the week, bought groceries with a level of calculation that he hadn't applied to a shopping cart since the year after Sarah died, and sat at the kitchen table working out numbers that refused to add up in any direction he needed them to. His checking account had a balance of $67. His next rent payment was in 11 days. His suspension had no confirmed end date, and the attorney, Patricia Okonkwo, had been honest with him last week. Federal investigations operated on federal timelines, which meant weeks at minimum and realistically months. And in the meantime, Ironcrest's legal department had filed a formal countercomplaint with the FAA that had the specific quality of something designed not to succeed, but to delay. He closed the laptop because looking at the numbers wasn't producing new numbers. Chloe was at school. The apartment was quiet in the specific way of mid-morning weekdays when the building mostly emptied out. He could hear the radiator doing its thing in the corner, a sound he'd learned to sleep through but which, in quiet rooms, had a personality. He thought about calling his brother in Denver, who had offered money twice since the suspension, and whom Ethan had declined twice because accepting felt like admitting a defeat he hadn't yet technically suffered. He thought about it seriously this time, ran the math on pride versus practicality. Then his phone rang. Not a number he recognized, but a 202 area code, which was Washington, D.C. He answered. "Mr. Carter? This is Special Agent Diane Kaur, FAA Office of Inspector General. I'm calling regarding the whistleblower submission filed under your name approximately 3 weeks ago. Is this a good time to speak?" Ethan stood up from the kitchen table. "Yes," he said. "It's a fine time." Her voice was measured and professional and gave away almost nothing. She said she'd reviewed the documentation package he'd submitted and had shared it with her team. She said the materials were detailed and that they had questions. She said she wanted to arrange an in-person meeting as soon as possible and that someone from her office would be traveling to Duluth within the next 2 weeks. She also said, and she said this in the same flat professional tone as everything else, that in their preliminary review, they had identified elements of the documentation that were consistent with a pattern they had seen before in aviation fraud investigations. Ethan sat back down. "Before in what way?" he asked. "That's something we'd like to discuss in person," she said. "I'd also ask that you not discuss this call with your employer or with anyone connected to Ironcrest Aviation's current management. That includes anyone in a supervisory capacity." "I understand," he said. After he hung up, he sat very still for about a minute. The radiator did its thing. Somewhere below in the building, a door closed. Then he called Marcus because Marcus counted as neither management nor supervision and said, "The OIG called." Marcus's silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. "When are they coming?" 2 weeks. "Good," Marcus said. "We need to be further along on the fuel system by then." That was Marcus. Not a man who wasted time on the emotional texture of good news. Just the next task. "Marcus," Ethan said. "Yeah. Thank you for doing this." A pause that had a particular quality to it. 22 years, Marcus said. "I should have looked harder at that aircraft 8 years ago. I walked past it every day for a year after it got grounded, And I told myself it wasn't my job to wonder about it. Another pause. It was my job. He hung up before Ethan could respond to that. Ethan put his phone down and looked at the kitchen table, which had at some point become the nerve center of an investigation he hadn't intended to run. There were printed documents in organized stacks, a physical timeline pinned to a corkboard he'd bought from the dollar store and propped against the wall, and a series of photographs arranged by date. On the corkboard, connected by a green piece of yarn he'd repurposed from Chloe's craft supplies, was a sequence that now included Raymond Cole's name at one end and a question mark at the other. He knew Cole wasn't working alone. The maintenance record alterations required system-level access that Cole could have arranged, but which suggested involvement from at least one other person inside Ironcrest's IT infrastructure. The communication routing module in the Falcon X9's avionics bay had been installed by someone with physical access and technical knowledge. Cole had the knowledge, but the physical access would have required either a legitimate reason to be in the hangar or help from someone who had one. The question mark was the second person. He stared at it for a while. Then he got up, made coffee, and went back to work. The fuel system wasn't going to fix itself. The escalation came 4 days later, and it came from a direction Ethan hadn't expected. He was at the facility. It was one of his 3 weekly evening visits, the ones made possible by the slow administrative response time of Ironcrest's badge deactivation system and the specific moral philosophy of a security guard named Pete, who had been at Ironcrest for 15 years, and who Ethan suspected was aware of his evening presence and had developed a principled policy of facing the other direction at the relevant moments. He and Danny were deep in the fuel system routing when Danny said, "Someone's been in here since Tuesday." Ethan looked up. Danny was crouched near the aft fuel bay, pointing at something on the panel surface. Ethan came around and looked. There were tool marks on the panel fasteners. Fresh ones, the kind you got when someone used a slightly wrong-sized socket driver and left micro-scratches in the coating. The kind that happened when you were working quickly or working in the dark. "Did Marcus come in without us?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. "Marcus is visiting his daughter in Milwaukee until Thursday." Ethan crouched beside Danny and looked at the marks. Then he opened the panel carefully and looked at what was inside. The fuel system they'd spent 3 weeks carefully restoring had a new problem. Specifically, a fuel flow sensor that they'd verified and tested as functional 6 days ago was now reading incorrectly. Not broken, not obviously tampered with, but calibrated wrong in a way that would cause it to report normal fuel pressure when actual fuel delivery was compromised. It was the kind of failure mode that, during a flight, could present as an engine issue rather than a fuel supply issue, and which could cause a pilot to respond incorrectly and dangerously. Ethan stared at it for a long moment. "This wasn't an accident," Danny said quietly. "No. If that sensor reads wrong during a flight test, I know what it would do." Danny sat back on his heels. He looked, for the first time since Ethan had known him, genuinely scared rather than performatively anxious. "Ethan, this isn't... They're not just trying to discredit you anymore. If someone tampered with the fuel system knowing we're going to run a flight test, I know. I know, Danny." Ethan kept his voice steady because he needed to think and panic, while understandable, was not useful right now. He photographed the sensor, documented the tool marks on the panel, and made a precise written note of the calibration reading with timestamps. Then he pulled the sensor entirely and replaced it with a verified unit from their parts inventory. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours, differently than before, more alert, checking their work twice, documenting everything obsessively. At one point, Danny startled at a sound from the far end of the hangar, and they both held completely still until they confirmed it was the building settling in the cold. At 11:30, Ethan sent Danny home. "You shouldn't be alone in here," Danny said. "I'm leaving too. Go." He waited until Danny's car had left the lot. Then he sat in the cockpit of the Falcon X9 in the dark for about 10 minutes with his phone in his hand. He was thinking about the sensor calibration, about what it would have done during a flight test. He was thinking about it specifically and clearly and without the protection of abstraction, and what he arrived at, sitting in the dark cockpit of an aircraft that someone had now tried to sabotage twice, was a clean and accurate fear. Not for the investigation, not for his job, for himself. For the specific physical fact of himself, who had a daughter asleep right now in an apartment across town with an ocean sound machine with a crack in the corner. He was afraid. He sat with it, didn't push it away. That never worked. Just let it exist alongside the other things he knew, which were the sensor was now corrected, the evidence was documented, the OIG was coming in 10 days, and he had come too far in the wrong direction to turn around now without abandoning everything that had gotten him here. He climbed out of the cockpit and drove home. He checked the apartment locks. He looked in on Chloe, who was asleep in her usual position with the bear and the ocean sounds. He went to bed. He slept badly. In the morning, he called Patricia Okonkwo before Chloe woke up and told her about the fuel system sensor. He kept his voice neutral and factual. She listened without interrupting. "That changes the risk profile of your situation significantly," she said. "I'm aware. I need you to listen to me carefully. This has moved from corporate fraud into something that could involve charges of endangerment, potentially worse, depending on intent. The OIG needs to know about this before their visit, not when they arrive. How do I get it to them fast? I'll contact Agent Core directly today. You send me everything you documented last night, photographs, timestamps, the calibration data, within the next hour." He sent it within 20 minutes. 2 hours later, Patricia called back. "Core is moving the visit up. Someone from their office will be in Duluth in 4 days." That afternoon, Margaret Whitmore sent him a text message from a number she'd never used before, a different one than the number she'd given him in the parking garage. The text said only, "Be careful in that building. I mean this literally." He stared at it for a while. He typed back, "How much do you know?" The response took 11 minutes. Enough to be concerned, not enough to act on it officially. "The board meeting is in 6 days. Whatever you have, it needs to be ready." He put the phone down and looked at the corkboard on the kitchen table. The question mark at the end of the green yarn was still there, but it was getting smaller. The night before the OIG investigators arrived, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling for 2 hours, then gave up, got up, and went to the kitchen. He made tea. He'd switched from coffee after midnight because the coffee wasn't helping anything except his anxiety, and sat at the table in the quiet. He thought about the 90-day promise he'd made in the boardroom. He'd said it in a moment of conviction that surprised even him, watching the polished dismissal on those faces, and there had been a specific kind of anger underneath it. Not hot anger, but cold, functional anger, the kind that produces action rather than noise. He'd meant it when he said it. He'd believed it. What he hadn't fully calculated was what standing by that promise would cost. $312. Then $67. He'd borrowed $800 from his brother in Denver, and his brother had sent it without comment and without using the word loan, which was a kindness Ethan didn't know how to repay except by eventually fixing the situation. The suspension had stripped away the structure of his days, which turned out to matter more than he'd expected. He'd always been someone who organized himself around work, not because he loved the work itself, though he did, genuinely, but because the routine gave shape to everything else, and without it, the days had a formlessness that sat badly with him. Chloe had noticed. She was 9 and she was perceptive in the way of children who've learned early to read adult emotional weather because the adults around them needed help noticing. She didn't ask directly. She'd developed a habit of not asking directly about things that were clearly difficult for him, which he wasn't sure was healthy, but which he appreciated and also felt guilty about. What she did instead was find ways to be helpful in small, specific ways. She'd started making her own lunch without being asked. She'd begun putting her dishes in the dishwasher before he could remind her. One evening, she'd handed him a drawing she'd made, a picture of him at a workbench, recognizable only because she'd labeled the figure Dad in large letters and drawn an airplane in the background, and said, "I made this for your office for when you go back." He'd put it in his folder with the documentation, not strategically, just because it helped. He sat at the kitchen table with his tea, not looking at the corkboard this time, but at the window, where the Duluth night had the particular quality of October, dark, early, cold with specific weight, the kind of cold that meant the season had changed and wasn't pretending otherwise. He thought about Victoria Hale. He'd thought about her a few times since the parking garage conversation with Margaret. Margaret's assessment that Victoria wasn't the enemy, that she'd come into a situation she didn't fully understand and was operating on bad information, resonated with something Ethan recognized, because that was exactly his situation with the Falcon X9 at the beginning. You could be wrong, he knew, without being dishonest. You could make decisions that were bad while trying to make decisions that were good. The difference was what you did when you found out. He didn't know what Victoria Hale would do when she found out. He'd seen her in the boardroom, confident, efficient, carrying the specific weight of authority in a way that looked like armor. He'd seen her look at him like he was a problem to classify and move past. He'd also seen her take the documentation he'd slid across the table and actually read it, even if she'd ultimately sided with the institutional answer rather than the uncomfortable one. He thought she might surprise him. He also thought she might not, and he needed to be ready for either. The tea got cold. He went to bed. This time he slept. The two investigators from the FAA's Office of Inspector General were not what Ethan had built in his mind. He'd imagined federal agents in the way movies had shaped the category, polished, authoritative, projecting certainty. What arrived at Patricia Okonkwo's office on a rainy Thursday morning were two people who looked tired in the way of people who traveled constantly for work and had stopped fighting it. Agent Diane Kaur was in her mid-40s, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on, and a habit of writing things in a physical notebook rather than a device, which she explained without being asked. I process information better when I write it. Don't read anything into the notebook. Her colleague was a younger man named Agent Torres, who took photographs of everything Ethan showed them and spoke rarely but precisely when he did. They met for 4 hours. Ethan walked them through the complete documentation sequence, starting from the original incident report and the inconsistencies he'd identified through the secondary maintenance log analysis, the component identification and provenance research, the IC-304 parallel, and the two in-hangar incidents, the moved component in the avionics bay, and the tampered fuel system sensor. Agent Kaur did not interrupt him often. When she did, her questions were specific and technical, and she wrote the answers down in the notebook. At the end of his presentation, she set down the notebook and looked at him across Patricia's conference table. "Mr. Carter," she said, "what you've assembled here is significantly more comprehensive than the typical whistleblower submission we receive. That's not a compliment meant to flatter you. It's relevant to how we proceed." She paused. "The component you identified in the avionics bay, the secondary communications routing module from Vantage Aerosystems. We've seen that component before." Ethan went still. "Not in this context," she continued. "In a different investigation, different company, different state, but the same component installed in a similar irregular fashion." She exchanged a look with Torres. "That investigation concluded 14 months ago without prosecution because we couldn't establish clear chain of custody for the physical evidence. The aircraft in question had been repaired before we examined it. The pattern from 8 years ago," Ethan said. "The IC-304 incident. We're aware of IC-304. It's now part of a broader file that your submission has contributed to substantially." She put the glasses back on. "I want to be transparent with you about one thing. What you've uncovered, the scale of it, if our preliminary assessment is correct, is not a single rogue employee making bad decisions. This is organized. It's been running for years, which means the people responsible have had years to build legal insulation." "Can you prove it?" Ethan asked. "We believe we can. Your documentation, combined with materials we've developed independently, gives us a viable evidentiary foundation." She paused. "But Mr. Carter, we need the Falcon X9 intact. We need physical access to that aircraft before anything is moved, repaired, or scrapped. And we need it before whoever is responsible decides the situation has become untenable and takes action." "The board meeting is in 5 days," Ethan said. Kaur looked at Torres. Torres looked at his phone. "Then we have 4 days," she said. What happened in those 4 days moved faster than anything in the previous weeks. The OIG coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota. A federal preservation order was issued covering the Falcon X9 and all associated maintenance documentation, which meant Ironcrest Aviation was legally barred from scrapping, modifying, or relocating the aircraft. This order arrived at Ironcrest's legal department on a Friday evening, which Ethan noted with some satisfaction was the corporate equivalent of the trash they'd tried to take out on him, and generated what Jerry Marsh later described to Ethan weeks afterward as 45 minutes of extremely expensive conference calls. Investigators with physical forensics capability examined the Falcon X9 and confirmed the tampered fuel system sensor, the secondary communications module, and, this was the part Ethan hadn't found, a data logging bypass installed in the aircraft's flight management system that would have transmitted operational data to an external server during flight tests, not Ironcrest server. They also found, inside a panel in the cockpit ceiling that Ethan hadn't opened because it required a specialized tool he hadn't had access to, a small device that Agent Torres later described in his formal report as a passive monitoring unit consistent with proprietary data extraction methodology. Someone hadn't just been sabotaging the aircraft, they'd been using it. The specific mechanics of what it had been used for took investigators several more weeks to untangle, but the short version that emerged was this. The Falcon X9, officially declared a dead aircraft sitting abandoned in a hangar, had been quietly functioning as a data pipeline. Its systems had been accessed intermittently over the past 3 years. Information moved through the communications routing module to external servers registered to a shell company with third-party ownership that, when forensic accountants eventually traced it through 4 layers of corporate structure, led back to Vantage Aerosystems. And Vantage Aerosystems' largest private investor, not publicly listed, held through a discretionary investment vehicle, was a holding group that included Raymond Cole as a named beneficial owner. Ethan didn't learn all of this immediately. He learned it in pieces, over days, some of it from Patricia Okonkwo, and some of it from Margaret Whitmore, and some of it from a timeline he assembled himself from what he could observe and what he was told. What he did learn immediately, on the Saturday morning 2 days before the board meeting, was that Raymond Cole had requested an emergency leave of absence from Ironcrest Aviation, citing personal health reasons, effective immediately. Marcus called him with this information at 7:15 in the morning. "He's going to run," Marcus said. "He can't run. The preservation order covers him. A person who spent years planning how to disappear from a company he was destroying doesn't need to physically run," Marcus said. "He just needs to get his paperwork in order before the board meeting." That was a reasonable concern. Ethan called Patricia, who called Agent Core, who had apparently already been monitoring this development, and responded with the calm efficiency of someone who'd anticipated exactly this move. By 10 that morning, a federal hold had been placed on Raymond Cole's travel documentation. Ethan didn't feel triumphant about this. He felt tired and strung out in the way of someone who's been running on inadequate sleep and inadequate money for too long, and who can sense something ending without yet being able to trust that the ending is the right kind. He spent that Saturday with Chloe deliberately. Not as a distraction, he'd made a rule for himself that he wouldn't use her as a distraction from his own difficult feelings, because that was unfair to her even if she couldn't articulate why, but because he genuinely needed a day with his kid. She wanted to go to the Science Museum, which they hadn't done since spring, and he said yes, and they spent 4 hours looking at the aviation exhibit, which was Chloe's favorite, even though she claimed she liked the geology section better because she didn't want to seem predictable. At the aviation exhibit, she stood for a long time in front of a cross-section model of a turbofan engine, and Ethan stood next to her and watched her trace the airflow diagram with her finger the same way he used to as a kid, before he knew what anything was called, just following the shape of the thing. "Dad," she said, still looking at the model. "Yeah. Is the airplane going to fly?" He hadn't told her the details. He told her he was working on a problem at work, and that it was taking longer than expected. She was 9, and she was smart enough to know there was more to it than that, and she'd apparently decided to hold the question until now. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's going to fly." She nodded slowly. "Good." A pause. "I told Emma at school that my dad is fixing a plane that everyone said was broken forever. She said that sounds like a movie." "What did you say?" "I said it kind of is," she said. "Except you're not as dramatic as movie people usually are." He laughed. It surprised him slightly, the genuineness of it, the way it came up from somewhere. "I'll work on the drama," he said. "Don't," she said seriously. "It's fine. The drama is always fake anyway." They ate hot dogs from the museum cafeteria and drove home in the Silverado with the non-pine air freshener, and Chloe fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window at the specific angle that always made Ethan reach over and check that her seatbelt wasn't cutting into her neck. It wasn't. He drove through the Duluth evening with his daughter asleep beside him, and the case nearly closed and the board meeting 2 days away, and he tried to feel prepared for whatever was coming. He mostly felt exhausted, but there was something under the exhaustion that he recognized, the same thing he'd felt when the engines turned over in the hangar, when the sound filled the cold air and proved the thing everyone had said was dead was not dead at all. A kind of bedrock certainty that continuing was correct. It wasn't comfort, it wasn't confidence. It was something more durable than either of those. The simple, factual knowledge that he had done the right things in the right order, and that the work was real, and the evidence was real, and whatever happened next, those things would remain true. That had to be enough. For 2 more days, at least, it had to be enough. The board meeting was on a Monday morning, and Ethan Carter was not supposed to be there. His suspension was still technically in effect. He had no formal standing in the meeting. He had received no official invitation. What he had was a phone call from Margaret Whitmore on Sunday evening at 9:47, which said, "Be in the building at 8 tomorrow morning. Don't park in the main lot. Use the east service entrance and wait near the maintenance corridor on the 2nd floor. I'll come find you." She hung up before he could ask questions. He wore the button-down flannel because it was his cleanest shirt. He thought about the dress shirt with the coffee stain on the cuff and decided against it. He thought about shaving more carefully than usual and then shaved the same way he always did, which was functionally rather than precisely. He drove to Ironcrest. He parked in the east lot. He went through the service entrance using a badge that still worked, which felt like it might be significant. He waited in the maintenance corridor on the 2nd floor, which smelled like floor cleaner and something else he couldn't name, and watched the clock on his phone move from 8:02 to 8:17. At 8:18, Margaret Whitmore appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking quickly and with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to it. "They've confirmed Cole's involvement through the federal investigation," she said without preamble. "The OIG briefed the board chair this morning at 6:30. The meeting has been reframed." What does that mean? It means what was supposed to be a quarterly operations review is now an emergency governance meeting. She looked at him steadily. "Victoria Hale requested that you be present. Specifically, she did this at 7 a.m., which means she made that decision sometime yesterday." Ethan absorbed this. "She's ready to hear it," Margaret said. "I want you to understand that. She's not going to be easy. She doesn't do easy. But she's ready to hear what you found." "And Cole?" "Cole's attorney has been notified. He's not present in the building." A pause. "Raymond is not going to be part of this company by the end of the day." She started walking toward the boardroom. "Mr. Carter," she said without turning around, "whatever happens in that room, you did the work. That's what matters. Don't get lost in what anyone says about it." He followed her down the corridor toward the boardroom where, 6 weeks ago, he'd sat at the far end of the table and watched people laugh and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who knows something true that nobody in the room wants to hear. He wondered what Victoria Hale looked like when she was listening. He was about to find out. The boardroom looked different at 8:30 in the morning than it had the first time Ethan walked into it. Same glass table, same leather chairs, same brushed aluminum logo on the wall. But the quality of the light was different. The early morning sun coming through the tarmac-facing windows at a low angle that caught the dust in the air and made the room feel less polished than it had before, less designed. More like a place where actual things were about to happen, rather than a place designed to suggest that actual things had already been decided elsewhere. There were 9 people at the table when Margaret walked Ethan in. He recognized 4 of them from his first visit. The others were new faces. 2 he didn't know at all, and 1 he identified after a moment as the company's general counsel, a woman named Sandra Briggs, who had the specific expression of an attorney who had received very bad news very early in the morning and had not yet finished processing it. Victoria Hale was at the head of the table. She looked up when Ethan entered. Something passed across her face, not quite what he'd expected. Not hostility, and not the classified and managed distance from the first meeting either. Something more direct than that. Something that looked, uncomfortably, like assessment that had already concluded. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the table, not at the far end this time. Margaret had pulled out the chair 4 seats from Victoria's right, and Ethan sat in it, and for a moment the geometry of the room was simply different from what it had been 6 weeks ago. Victoria looked around the table once, briefly, with the expression of someone who has decided the meeting is starting, whether everyone is ready or not. "We're going to do this cleanly," she said. "Sandra has advised me on the legal parameters of what we can discuss before the formal federal process is complete. I've heard that advice, and I intend to stay within it." She paused. "Within those parameters, the board has been briefed on the OIG investigation, the federal preservation order on the Falcon X9, and the materials filed by Mr. Carter. I want to hear from him directly. Not a summary, directly." Sandra Briggs looked like she had a comment about this, but was choosing not to make it. Ethan laid his hands flat on the table, a habit he'd developed when he was nervous and needed to appear otherwise, and started talking. He went through it the same way he'd gone through it with the OIG investigators, except compressed, because he was reading the room, and the room had a different energy than a federal interview. This room knew some of what he knew and was sitting with the specific discomfort of powerful people who have realized that a problem they dismissed was real. He didn't try to soften that. He moved through the timeline clearly. The documentation inconsistencies, the avionics component, the fuel system tamper, the data extraction device, the provenance chain to Vantage Aerosystems, and the beneficial ownership trail that led back to Raymond Cole. He spoke for 22 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, the room was quiet in the particular way of 9 people all deciding simultaneously how to respond. Victoria was the one who broke it. "When you came to this room 6 weeks ago," she said, "and told us the aircraft didn't fail on its own, you already knew this." "Not all of it," he said. "I knew the documentation was wrong. I suspected the rest. But you were certain enough to make that statement in front of the board." "I was certain enough about what I'd found to know it needed to be taken seriously, yes." She looked at him steadily. "And when we didn't take it seriously, you made a decision based on what you had in front of you," he said. "What you had in front of you was an engineering firm's assessment and a level 2 mechanic's word against it. I understand why you made that call." Something shifted slightly in her expression. He wasn't sure how to read it. "That's a generous interpretation," she said. "It's the accurate one," he said. He wasn't being generous, he was being precise. He'd thought about it enough to know the difference. One of the board members Ethan didn't know, an older man with the careful voice of someone experienced in high-stakes rooms, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, the documentation you filed with the OIG described tampered evidence, including a fuel system modification that you characterized as potentially fatal if undetected during a flight test. Can you speak to the current status of the aircraft's safety?" "Marcus Webb and I have corrected the fuel system sensor and removed the unauthorized communications module," Ethan said. "The aircraft's physical systems are in a significantly better state than they were 3 weeks ago. But I want to be clear. Airworthiness certification requires independent inspection. Everything Marcus and I have done needs to be verified. The aircraft needs to go through proper channels before anyone flies it." "How long?" "If we get authorization to resume work today and the inspection process moves on a standard timeline, 4 to 6 weeks, assuming no additional issues." "And if there are additional issues?" Ethan paused. "There might be. We haven't been able to do a full interior inspection because of the preservation order. Once forensics clears the aircraft, we'll know what else we're dealing with." Margaret, who had said nothing since they sat down, spoke then. Her voice was measured and had the quality of someone who had been waiting to say something specific. "I want the board to note for the record that Mr. Carter continued this work under suspension, under financial duress, and after 2 incidents that should be classified as direct intimidation." She looked around the table. "He continued it without any guarantee of outcome and without institutional support. I think that matters to how we understand what's in front of us today." Another pause. Victoria hadn't looked away from Ethan during this exchange. "What did the intimidation look like?" she asked. Not to Margaret, to him. He told her about the move tools, the disappeared system files, the anonymous complaints, the formal retaliation allegation, and the tampered truck. He told it flat, without dramatic emphasis, because the facts were dramatic enough without help. When he finished, her expression had changed in a way he still couldn't fully categorize. She looked like someone who had been running a system and had just discovered that the system had been fed false data from the beginning. "I owe you an apology," she said. The directness of it caught him off guard. He hadn't expected that. Not in a boardroom, not from her. "You don't have to he started. "I'm not doing it because I have to," she said, with a slight edge that was somehow not unkind. "I'm doing it because it's accurate. I dismissed you because of your job title. That was a poor decision, and I won't dress it up as something else." She paused. "You were right, and I was wrong. That's the whole of it." The room was quiet again. Ethan nodded once. He didn't know what else to do with it. He wasn't practiced at receiving apologies from CEOs. "What do you need to finish the aircraft?" Victoria asked. It was such a clean pivot that it almost made him laugh. The apology delivered and the apology done. Attention already moving forward. "Full access to Hangar 7 once forensics clears it," he said. "2 mechanics, Webb and Reyes, with authorized overtime. Parts authorization for anything we identify in the final inspection, and an independent airworthiness inspector assigned at the company's expense." "Done," she said. "What else?" He looked at her. He hadn't prepared for this part because he hadn't fully believed he'd get to it. "That's it for the aircraft. That's all I need." She held his gaze for a moment. "Fine. Sandra, get the suspension rescinded today. Process his back pay for the suspension period." She looked back at Ethan. "You'll have full access to the hangar by this afternoon." Sandra Briggs was writing something down with the focused energy of a lawyer who had pivoted from damage control to implementation. The meeting ran for another 40 minutes, covering matters that Ethan was mostly not central to. Procedural questions about the federal investigation, the board's response to the coal situation, communication strategy for the employees and for the press when this became public. Ethan sat and listened and said what he needed to say when asked. When it concluded and people began moving toward the door, Margaret caught his eye across the table and gave him a small, precise nod. Not triumphant, just acknowledging. He nodded back. Victoria Hale was speaking with Sandra at the far end of the table. As Ethan moved toward the door, she spoke without turning. "Carter." He stopped. "Good work," she said. Still not looking at him, focused on whatever Sandra was showing her on a tablet. It was said the way she seemed to do most things, directly, without decoration, without the specific warmth that might have made it easier to receive, but also without anything false about it. He left the boardroom. In the hallway, he exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Then he took the elevator down to the hangar level and walked to Hangar 7, because there was still work to do. The access question resolved itself faster than he expected. By 2 in the afternoon, forensics had cleared the bulk of the aircraft for continued maintenance work, retaining only the specific panels and components they needed for physical evidence documentation. By 3, Marcus had arrived, back from Milwaukee, updated on everything during a 90-minute phone call that Ethan had made while eating a sandwich in the hangar at lunchtime, and was already inside the portside inspection panel with the focused expression of a man making up for lost time. Danny showed up at 3:30 with coffee from the place 2 blocks away that was too expensive, but which Danny had a loyalty card for. He handed Ethan a cup and looked at the aircraft, and then at Ethan and said, "So it's real now. We're actually doing this." "We've been doing it," Ethan said. "Yeah, but now we're doing it with permission." Danny sipped his coffee. "That's different. That's better." It was better. Ethan noticed it. The specific quality of working on something when the ground beneath it was stable. They'd been doing this work for weeks under a kind of suspended threat that required constant background attention, a portion of awareness always monitoring the exits, always tracking who else was in the building. That was gone now, and the absence of it made the work feel different. Lighter in a practical sense, not a sentimental one. They spent the rest of the afternoon doing the full interior inspection that the preservation order had prevented. What they found was encouraging in some respects and not in others. The main structural systems, airframe, primary hydraulics, landing gear actuation, were in reasonable condition given the years of inactivity. The damage that had been deliberately introduced over the years, while persistent in its documentation, had not been severe enough to compromise structural integrity. Whoever had sabotaged the aircraft had been trying to make it look unflyable, not actually destroy it, which made sense, Ethan thought, given that its value to them was as a functional data platform. You couldn't run a data extraction operation off a truly dead aircraft. What was actually wrong with the Falcon X9, stripped of the deliberate sabotage, was the ordinary degradation of a machine that had sat idle for 6 years. Dried seals, corrosion on non-critical components, avionics systems that needed complete recalibration, turbine blades with surface scoring that needed assessment, and likely replacement. Real problems. Fixable problems. 6 weeks was optimistic, Marcus said from under the port engine nacelle on the second day. His voice was muffled by the nacelle housing, but the tone was clear enough. Could be worse, Ethan said. Could be worse doesn't fill a timeline. 8 weeks, Ethan said. A pause. Maybe. 8 weeks, Marcus. Ask me again in 2 weeks when we know what the turbines look like under load. That was the other thing that shifted once the suspension was lifted, and the work was legitimate. Marcus's particular brand of engagement. He'd always been thorough, but now he was meticulous in a way that was almost aggressive, documenting everything, double-checking everything, running diagnostics twice when once was technically sufficient. Ethan understood it without asking. This was Marcus paying a debt he'd decided he owed, and he was going to pay it precisely. Danny was different. Danny's energy was kinetic and slightly chaotic, in the way of someone who functioned well under pressure and less well in its absence, and now that the threat had formally resolved itself, he was compensating with volume. He talked more. He played music from a portable speaker that Marcus tolerated because it was actually not bad. He made optimistic statements about the aircraft's condition that were sometimes accurate and sometimes the product of wishful thinking, and Ethan let him have both because the optimism, even when imprecise, kept the energy in the hangar moving forward. On the 4th day after the board meeting, Raymond Cole was formally charged. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed a criminal complaint alleging wire fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit aviation safety violations. There were 7 counts in total, and the accompanying press release from the U.S. Attorney described the scheme in language that was measured but fairly damning. Ethan read about it on his phone during a lunch break, sitting on the floor of the hangar with his back against the landing gear bay. He read the whole thing twice. Then he put his phone away and went back to work because there was no version of reading it a third time that was going to make the turbine blade assessment go any faster. The press coverage was significant. Ironcrest Aviation's name was in national aviation trade publications within 24 hours, and in the general business press by the second day. The angle varied depending on the outlet. Some focused on the corporate espionage angle, some on the aviation safety implications. One trade publication ran an extremely detailed technical breakdown of the data extraction methodology that Ethan read with the specific interest of someone who recognized the system being described. A reporter from an aviation industry outlet called Ironcrest Communications Department and asked specifically about the mechanic who had identified the sabotage. The Communications Department's response, approved by Victoria Hale, Ethan later learned, was 3 sentences that confirmed he was an Ironcrest employee and described his role in identifying the maintenance irregularities and that the company was grateful for his diligence. It was the kind of statement that said something without saying much. Ethan was fine with that. What he was not fine with, and what he discovered on the Thursday of that same week, was that someone had found his daughter's school. He was picking Chloe up at 3:15 when a man he didn't recognize approached him in the pickup line. The man was wearing a press lanyard and carried a camera and said, "Mr. Carter, I'm a reporter with..." Ethan positioned himself between the reporter and the school entrance without deciding to do it, the movement purely physical and immediate. "Not here," he said. His voice was quiet and even and left no room for interpretation. "I just wanted to ask a few quick questions about..." "Not here," Ethan said again. "Not near this school, not near my daughter. We're done." The reporter read something in his face, whatever it was that moved into his expression when things involved Chloe, and stepped back. Chloe appeared at the school entrance a moment later, purple coat, bouncing backpack, and did not notice the reporter or the camera or the specific tension in her father's posture, because Ethan had rearranged his face by the time she looked at him. "You're right on time," she said approvingly. "Always," he said. He drove her home. He bought pizza because it was Thursday, and Thursday had been pizza night since Chloe was 5, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her dissect her slice with the systematic approach to food she'd developed sometime in the past year, eating the crust first, then the toppings, which was objectively wrong, but which she defended whenever challenged. "Are there going to be cameras at the airport?" she asked, not looking up from the deconstruction. He looked at her. "What did you hear?" "Emma's mom told Emma about it, and Emma told me." She ate a piece of crust. "She said you found out someone was doing something bad with an airplane, and now it's on the news." Ethan considered how much was appropriate for a 9-year-old and how much Chloe specifically could handle, and those were different calculations. Something like that, he said. Is that why you got suspended? Because you found out? Partly. She was quiet for a moment, still focused on the pizza. That's not fair, she said. Not dramatically, just stating it. No, he agreed. It wasn't. But you kept going anyway? Yeah. She looked up at him then with an expression he recognized. The particular look she got when she was processing something and had arrived at a conclusion that she wasn't entirely sure how to hold. She had Sarah's eyes. Not the color. Her eyes were darker than Sarah's. The expression. The way of looking at things directly that managed to be both clear and kind at the same time. Okay, she said, and went back to the pizza. He didn't push it. With Chloe, okay sometimes meant she was fine, and sometimes it meant she'd filed the thing somewhere she'd come back to later, on her own timeline. He'd learned to give her space for both. The turbine inspection results came back the following Monday. The company had authorized an independent aviation engineering firm, not the same one that had produced the original fraudulent assessment, a different one based in Minneapolis. And their lead engineer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Sung, who had the no-nonsense thoroughness of someone who had spent 20 years being right about aircraft and was uninterested in softening the delivery, spent 3 days on the Falcon X9 before sitting down with Ethan, Marcus, and Danny in the hangar office to go through her findings. The turbine blades had surface erosion consistent with age and the specific kind of contamination that occurred when an aircraft sat in a hangar with inconsistent environmental control. Replacement was required. That was expensive, and it was going to add time, 2.5 weeks, minimum, depending on parts availability. The avionics suite needed a complete software reload and calibration cycle, which was standard for an aircraft that had been dormant this long and which they'd anticipated. The airframe had 2 areas of minor corrosion that needed treatment and monitoring, but were not structurally significant. And the landing gear system, which they'd been most concerned about given the nature of the original fake incident report and what that had been designed to cover up, was actually in better condition than any of them had expected. The hydraulic actuators were worn but functional. The main gear assemblies were solid. What you've done here, Dr. Sung said at the end, looking around the hangar at the Falcon X9 with the expression of someone who found the whole situation professionally interesting, is restore a decade-old aircraft from deliberate negligence using 3 people in a parts authorization. I've seen worse work from full maintenance crews with twice the resources. She paused. I want to be clear about one thing. This aircraft was never a total loss. The original assessment that classified it as non-recoverable was not based on accurate data. We know, Marcus said. Yes, you clearly do. She looked at Ethan. I'll have the written report to the company by Wednesday. The turbine replacements are the critical path. Once those are in and tested, we can start the certification flight sequence. The certification sequence? How many flights? Ethan asked. Minimum 4, probably 6, starting with basic systems checks at low altitude, working up to full performance envelope testing. She gathered her papers. The aircraft is going to fly. That's my professional assessment. It's going to take the time it takes to do it correctly, and it's going to fly. She left. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Danny broke the silence first because Danny always broke silences. Did she just say the aircraft is going to fly? Like, officially? She said it, Marcus confirmed. From the independent inspector. From the independent inspector, yes. Danny exhaled. It was not a composed sound. It was the sound of someone who had been holding a great deal of tension in a specific place and had just released it. Ethan didn't say anything. He looked at the Falcon X9, the aircraft he had walked past for 4 years, the aircraft he had seen in the early light through the dirty hangar window, rust amber and still, the aircraft that everyone, including himself, had sometimes doubted. He looked at it in the flat work light of the hangar office and thought about the 6 years it had spent in this building and the deliberate, careful work that had gone into making it look like something that couldn't be saved. He thought about Raymond Cole, now facing federal charges, who had understood aircraft well enough to compromise one with precision and had apparently not accounted for the possibility that someone would look carefully enough to see through it. Cole had miscalculated in a specific way. He had assumed that the layers of institutional dismissal, the job title, the silence, the worn boots, were permanent. That a level 2 mechanic would accept the official version because accepting the official version was what level 2 mechanics did. That was the mistake. Not a technical one, a human one. Ethan stood up and walked back into the hangar. The turbine parts were ordered. They'd arrive Thursday. He had work to do. The 2.5 weeks before the certification sequence were the strangest of the whole process. Not the most difficult, but the strangest. The threat was gone. The suspension was resolved. The back pay had hit his account with the specific, slightly surreal quality of money arriving after a long time of it not arriving. He'd paid the rent. He'd settled the overdue medical bill installment. He'd paid his brother back, which his brother had told him was unnecessary. And he'd done it anyway because it was necessary to him personally. The financial pressure lifted so gradually that he almost didn't notice until one evening he sat down at the kitchen table and realized he wasn't calculating before he opened the laptop. Just opened it. That was new. What was strange was the attention. The national coverage had done something he hadn't anticipated. It had made him recognizable in a way he was not accustomed to being. People at Ironcrest who had never spoken to him said hello in hallways. The woman at the coffee cart near the main entrance started handing him his order before he finished asking for it. Jerry Marsh, who had delivered the suspension notice with the expression of a man forced to do something unpleasant, now stopped by the hangar occasionally to check in with the specific earnestness of someone atoning for a small piece of a larger problem. Ethan handled all of this with the same slightly awkward grace with which he handled most social situations. Politely, without lingering, not unfriendly, but not encouraging. What he found harder to handle was Victoria Hale. She came to the hangar twice during the 2 weeks before the certification sequence. Not officially, not with a retinue of assistants and operations directors. Both times she came alone in the late afternoon wearing the same charcoal blazer over a white shirt she always seemed to wear. And both times she stayed for maybe 20 minutes, watching the work and asking technical questions that were more specific than he'd expected from a CEO. The second visit, she asked a question that he hadn't anticipated. He was calibrating the avionics sensor array, detailed, focused work that he was doing alone because Marcus was on a break and Danny was managing a parts delivery, when he heard her approach and looked up. "The data extraction device they found in the ceiling panel," she said. "How long do you think it had been there?" He set down the calibration tool. "Based on the dust profile and component dating, at least 2 years, possibly closer to 3. She was quiet for a moment. So for potentially 3 years, this aircraft was transmitting operational data from Ironcrest systems to a competitor, and nobody knew. Nobody who was looking the right direction, he said. "I came here to restructure costs," she said. It wasn't an excuse. Her tone didn't have that quality. It was more like someone reading back a fact they found troubling. "I looked at the asset register, saw an abandoned aircraft consuming hangar space with a total loss designation, and made the obvious call." "The obvious call was the right call given what you were shown," Ethan said. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Being generous about decisions that cost you significantly." She looked at him with the directness he'd come to recognize as simply her default mode. "Why?" He thought about it genuinely, rather than reflexively. "Because I've made decisions based on wrong information before. Everybody has. The information you had was wrong. What matters is what you do when you get the right information." She considered that. "And you think I did the right thing when I got it?" "I think you moved fast when you had reason to," he said. "Yeah." Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, because softened implied it had been hard before, and it hadn't been hard. It had been controlled. It shifted in the way of a constraint releasing slightly. "The certification sequence is scheduled for 2 weeks out," she said. "I'll be there." "Okay." She started to leave, then paused. "Carter, what you said in the first boardroom meeting. Someone made it look dead. At the time I thought you were being dramatic." "I know." "You weren't." "No," he said. "I wasn't." She left. Ethan picked up the calibration tool and went back to work. On the Friday before the flight test week, Dr. Sung completed the post-turbine replacement systems run and signed off on the aircraft as ready for the certification sequence. She handed Ethan the preliminary sign-off document in the hangar office with the same unadorned professional manner she'd maintained throughout, and said, "Everything checks out. The aircraft is ready to fly. The question now is who's flying it." That had been a question Ethan had deliberately not asked himself for the past several weeks, because it was not his question to ask. He was a mechanic. He was not a pilot. He had enough type ratings and enough cockpit familiarity from his training history to have an above-average understanding of what a pilot needed. But actually sitting the certification sequence required a certified test pilot with specific type experience on the Falcon X9's platform. Victoria had solved this before he'd raised it. She'd contracted a test pilot named Ben Carver, ex-Air Force, now commercial test pilot, with logged hours on the Falcon X9's predecessor platform, and the kind of credentials that made Dr. Sung nod in approval when she saw his file. Carver was a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s, who arrived on Monday, walked around the aircraft for 2 hours without saying much, asked Ethan a very specific series of technical questions about the restoration work, listened to the answers carefully, and then said, "Clean work. I'll fly it." That was it. That was all the endorsement Ethan needed, but it landed with a weight he hadn't anticipated. The certification flights were scheduled across 5 days, the final full performance flight on Friday morning. The Friday that everything had been moving toward, without exactly knowing it, since a cold November morning 6 years ago when a rust-covered aircraft had been rolled into Hangar 7 and declared by the people with the authority to declare such things dead. Thursday night, Ethan did not sleep well. This had become something of a pattern in his life, and he'd stopped fighting it. He got up at 1:30, made tea, sat at the kitchen table. The cork board was still there. He hadn't taken it down, partly because he kept thinking he should document things more formally before he did. The green yarn was still connecting Raymond Cole's name to the Vantage Aerosystems documentation. The question mark that had been at the end of it was gone. He'd removed it himself 2 weeks ago and replaced it with the name of Cole's external contact at Vantage, now also facing federal charges. The cork board looked like what it was, the working surface of a months-long investigation that had started because one man had read maintenance files. Nobody else was reading and noticed something that didn't fit. He thought about what tomorrow was. Not with drama. He was too tired for drama at 1:30 in the morning, but with a kind of plain attention. The Falcon X9 was going to fly its full performance certification flight in approximately 7 hours. It had been designed to fly, built to fly, and had been prevented from doing so by a deliberate and sustained effort to make it look like something that couldn't be saved. And Ethan Carter, who drove a cracked windshield truck and owned 3 flannel shirts and had borrowed $800 from his brother during the worst weeks of this, had spent 4 months proving that it could. He thought about Sarah. He did this deliberately, which was different from the way he sometimes thought about her without meaning to, which tended to be harder. He thought about her directly. Her voice, her specific laugh, the way she'd stood at the kitchen window when she was thinking, and he'd learned to recognize the thinking stance because it was different from the looking at something outside stance. He thought about what she'd said about him having a pattern, about always figuring it out. He drank his tea and sat in the kitchen with the corkboard and the silent apartment and the weight of what was coming in the morning. Then he went back to bed. He set his alarm for 5:30, which was earlier than necessary, because he wanted time to sit with the aircraft alone before everything else began. He had one more morning with the ghost before it stopped being one. Ethan arrived at Hangar 7 at 5:53 in the morning. The facility was nearly empty at that hour. A skeleton crew on the overnight rotation, a few maintenance staff arriving early for the first shift. The parking lot had the specific quality of pre-dawn industrial spaces, flat lighting, cold air with something damp in it, the distant sound of a taxiing aircraft somewhere on the far side of the field. The sky was the particular gray of early October mornings in Minnesota. Not stormy, not clear, just the neutral heavy overcast of a region that had stopped negotiating with autumn and accepted what was coming. He badged through the side entrance and walked the corridor to Hangar 7 alone. The hangar door was unlocked. Marcus had been in the night before doing final system checks and had left it secured but accessible. Ethan pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside and stood for a moment in the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The Falcon X9 sat in the center of the hangar under the overhead work lights that Marcus had left on low. The aircraft looked different than it had at any other point in the months Ethan had been working on it. Not dramatically different. It wasn't polished, wasn't gleaming, wasn't the kind of photogenic restoration you saw in aviation magazines where every surface reflected the photographer's light perfectly. The fuselage had a replaced panel on the port side that was a slightly different shade than the surrounding surface, waiting on a paint match that was scheduled for after the certification sequence. There were scuff marks near the nose gear bay from the inspection work. One of the wing fairings had a small dent that was structural 0 and cosmetic minor, and which they decided to address post-certification. It looked like an aircraft that had been through something, which it had. Ethan walked toward it slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty hangar in the way footsteps always echoed in this space. Something about the height of the ceiling and the way sound moved around the aircraft shapes. He'd heard his own footsteps in this hangar hundreds of times over 4 years, and he knew the specific acoustics of it, but this morning it felt different, heavier, more deliberate. He put his hand on the fuselage. The metal was cold from the night. He'd done this the first morning he worked on it seriously, touched the aircraft before opening a panel, before running a diagnostic, before anything. And he'd kept doing it out of habit or superstition or something between the two that he'd never examined closely. The metal was always cold in the morning. It warmed up fast once the systems were running. "Okay," he said quietly, to himself, to the aircraft, to the empty hangar. He stood there for about a minute, hand on the fuselage, not thinking about anything specific, just being present with it before the day filled up with everything the day was going to contain. Then he took his hand off the metal, opened his bag, and started the pre-flight documentation check. Marcus arrived at 6:40 with 2 coffees from the expensive place 2 blocks away. His own money this time, not the loyalty card. He handed one to Ethan without comment and looked at the aircraft for a moment with the same expression he'd had the night the engines turned over for the first time. The expression of a man confirming something. "How's she looking?" he asked. "Same as last night." "Good." He sipped his coffee. "Carver called me at 6. He wants the hydraulic pressure logs from the last 3 days. They're on the system. I'll pull them." He moved toward the workstation near the hangar wall. Then he stopped. "Ethan." "Yeah." Marcus turned around. He was not a demonstrative man, not in any direction, not toward warmth or coldness, just functionally direct. He looked at Ethan with the same careful steadiness he applied to everything. "This is the right outcome. I want you to know I'm aware of what it cost you to get here." Ethan held his gaze for a moment. "It cost you too." "My costs were different," Marcus said. "Mine were professional. Yours were personal." He paused. "There's a difference." He turned back to his workstation before Ethan could respond, which was probably intentional. Danny arrived at 7:15, on time for once, wearing a clean jacket and looking like someone who'd thought about this morning and decided presentation mattered. He was carrying a box of donuts from the bakery near his apartment. "For the occasion," he said, setting them on the workstation next to Marcus's coffee. "It's a certification flight," Marcus said without looking up from the hydraulic logs. "Not a birthday party." "Can it be both?" Marcus printed the hydraulic logs. "No." Danny looked at Ethan. "It can be both," he said quietly. "It can be both," Ethan confirmed. By 8, the hangar had transformed from the quiet space of an early morning into something with more energy and more people in it than Ethan was accustomed to. Ben Carver arrived with his flight bag and his deliberate economy of movement, went directly to the aircraft, and began his own pre-flight walkthrough. Independent of Ethan's documentation check, systematic and unhurried. Dr. Sung arrived at 8:15 and stood near the workstation reviewing her certification sign-off paperwork with the focused attention she brought to everything. 2 of the independent inspectors from her firm arrived shortly after. Personnel from Ironcrest's operations department appeared in 1s and 2s. Some of them Ethan knew. Some he'd never spoken to. They gathered near the hangar walls with the specific quality of people who understood this was something worth being present for without entirely knowing what they were supposed to do with themselves. Jerry Marsh arrived and found Ethan near the nose section. "How are you feeling?" Jerry asked. He asked it with genuine concern, which was the version of Jerry Marsh that Ethan had always known existed, and which had been somewhat suppressed during the months of suspension and compliance notices. "Ready," Ethan said. "Good." Jerry looked at the aircraft. He'd been at Ironcrest for 12 years and had presumably walked past the ghost many times. "I used to think about it sometimes," he said quietly. "The aircraft. After it was grounded. I'd walk through and see it sitting there and I'd think, that's a lot of money just sitting there." but it never occurred to me to ask why it was still sitting there. It didn't occur to most people, Ethan said. That's not an excuse. No, Ethan agreed. But it's true. Jerry nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else, then didn't, and moved away toward the operations group near the wall. At 8:40, Victoria Hale walked into Hangar 7. She came without the tablet-carrying assistants or the note-taking operations directors. She was with Sandra Briggs and one person Ethan didn't recognize who turned out to be the company's communications director, presumably there for whatever statement would follow the day's outcome. She was wearing the charcoal blazer over the white shirt. Her armor, Ethan had come to think of it, not unkindly. The controlled exterior of a person who'd learned early that control was the price of being taken seriously in rooms that were predisposed not to take you seriously. She found Ethan near the main gear bay where he was doing a final visual check. The weather's holding, she said. It's going to be fine, he said. Light cloud cover. Visibility's good. What time does Carver want to start the engines? 9:30 for APU, engines at 9:45. We're looking at a 10:10 departure window if everything checks clean. She nodded. She was looking at the aircraft with the expression she'd had during her second visit to the hangar. Not the CEO assessing an asset, but something more direct than that. Something that had arrived after the boardroom conversation when she'd said you were right and I was wrong with the same flat precision she used for everything, and which had changed the quality of how she looked at things here. Your daughter, she said. Is she coming? The question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, it wasn't, but because he hadn't expected her to ask it. She'll be here for the flight, he said. Mrs. Kowalski is bringing her. She has school this morning, so she couldn't come at 6. Victoria almost smiled. It was a small, brief thing, the expression of a person for whom smiling was a limited resource and was therefore notable when it appeared. She knows about all of this. More than I've told her, probably. Kids usually do. She looked back at the aircraft. I don't have children. I've thought about it in the abstract the way you think about things when work is the primary fact of your life. A pause. I never thought about what it would mean to do something difficult and have someone waiting for you to come home from it. Ethan looked at her sideways. She wasn't talking to him exactly. She was talking to the general air. It changes the calculation, he said. Does it make you more careful or less? He thought about it. Both. You're more careful about physical risk because the consequence isn't only yours. And you're less careful about taking on hard things because you've got a reason that doesn't require you to calculate whether it's worth it. It just is. She was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting way to think about risk, she said. It's the only way I've got, he said. She moved away to speak with Sandra. Ethan went back to the gear bay. At 9:15, the hangar doors were opened to the full width, and the ground crew that had been waiting outside began the tow operation, moving the Falcon X9 out of the hangar onto the tarmac apron for the first time in 6 years. It was a slow, careful process, the tow vehicle moving at walking speed, the aircraft emerging nose first from the hangar into the gray October morning. Something happened when it cleared the hangar door. It was hard to describe precisely, and Ethan would have been uncomfortable trying to describe it to anyone because it had a quality that resisted straightforward language. But when the aircraft came out into the open air for the first time in 6 years, when the Duluth morning light hit the fuselage and the wings extended into actual sky rather than hangar ceiling, something changed in the quality of the space. The dozen or so people standing around the tarmac went quiet, not from instruction or coordination. They just went quiet simultaneously, the way people do when they're witnessing something that earns the silence. Marcus was standing to Ethan's left, Danny to his right. Ethan watched the aircraft settle on the apron and felt something that he was going to file under relief because it was the closest available category, even though it wasn't quite that. It was more like the satisfaction of a true thing becoming visible. The aircraft was real, and it was here, and the 6 years it had spent being declared something it wasn't were over. There she is, Danny said softly. Nobody responded to that. They didn't need to. Ben Carver did his exterior walk-around on the apron with the systematic thoroughness of a test pilot for whom thoroughness was professional identity. He worked from nose to tail, port side to starboard, gear bays to engine nacelles, without rushing and without cutting corners. He crouched under the wings and stood on the maintenance steps and opened inspection points that Ethan had opened 100 times over the past months. When he was done, he came back to where Ethan was standing. "Clean," he said. "Good work." Coming from Carver, those 3 words had a particular weight. "Thank you," Ethan said. At 9:40, people began moving from the immediate apron area to the observation positions, a designated area near the maintenance building where a low barrier had been set up, creating a clear sightline to the runway. Ironcrest employees had been gathering since mid-morning, and the group had grown larger than Ethan expected. He'd heard from Jerry that several staff from the administrative building had come down. The overnight rotation mechanics, who should have gone home, had stayed. There were people he didn't recognize who turned out to be from the avionics and parts departments, people who worked in buildings on the other side of the facility, who had walked over because they'd heard what was happening. They lined up along the barrier the way people line up for things that matter, and Ethan saw it and felt something complicated about it, grateful and slightly overwhelmed, and also aware that none of these people had been particularly visible during the months when the work was difficult and the outcome was uncertain. That was human nature, and he didn't hold it against them. People showed up for the thing they could show up for. Most of the time, that was the ending rather than the middle. Mrs. Kowalski arrived with Chloe at 9:50. Ethan saw them coming across the tarmac. Chloe in her purple coat with her backpack still on because she'd apparently come straight from school, walking fast in the way she always walked when she was excited and was trying not to show it, which manifested as purposefulness rather than restraint. Mrs. Kowalski was keeping pace beside her with the expression of a woman who had been briefed on the general situation and had decided to feel proud about it on Ethan's behalf since he was unlikely to feel sufficiently proud on his own. Chloe reached him and stopped. She looked at the aircraft on the apron and then at her father. "That's the plane," she said. "That's the plane." She looked at it for a long moment, then she looked back at him. "It looks bigger than I thought it would. Most things do, in person. Did you fix all of it?" "Me and Marcus and Danny." She considered this. "Can I say hi to Marcus?" "Yeah, he's right over there." She went over to Marcus, who received her with the careful warmth of a man who was not naturally demonstrative with children, but who had apparently decided some time ago that Chloe specifically warranted effort. He crouched to her level, and they had a brief conversation that Ethan couldn't hear, but which concluded with Chloe nodding seriously at something Marcus said, and Marcus nodding back with equal seriousness. Mrs. Kowalski appeared at Ethan's elbow. "She was very calm this morning," she said quietly. "I thought she'd be nervous, but she was calm." "She's been calm about this the whole time," Ethan said. "Children decide what to worry about," Mrs. Kowalski said. "They're better at it than adults. She decided this was going to be okay, so she treated it like it was going to be okay." She looked at him sideways. "You could learn from that." "I know," he said. "Good," she said, with the satisfied conclusiveness of a woman who had just made a point she considered important. At 10:05, Ben Carver climbed into the cockpit. The ground crew ran through the startup checklist coordination via radio, and Ethan stood at his designated position near the nose, close enough to observe, far enough to be clear of the danger zones, with his headset on and the specific focused calm of someone whose job at this point was to watch and trust the work. The APU came online at 10:08. Its whine was clean and even, exactly as it had been in every test they'd run over the past 2 weeks. Ethan breathed. The left engine startup sequence began at 10:11. And here was the thing about aircraft engines that Ethan had tried to explain to Chloe once and had not done successfully. There was a moment in the startup sequence where the engine was technically running but hadn't yet stabilized, a few seconds where the turbine was spinning up through a range of frequencies that produced a sound unlike anything in normal experience, a rising, slightly raw sound that was both mechanical and something else, something that carried in it the sense of enormous controlled force not yet fully tamed. The left engine hit that frequency and passed through it and stabilized into the smooth, powerful note of a running turbofan. The right engine followed 20 seconds later. Both engines running, stable, clean. Ethan didn't move. He stood at his position with his hands at his sides and listened to the sound of the thing that 6 years of false documentation and deliberate sabotage and institutional dismissal had tried to make permanent, and which had turned out to be, like most things that looked permanent, entirely temporary. The aircraft was alive. Around him, along the barrier, people were reacting. He was aware of it peripherally, the sounds of it, the energy of it. But he wasn't in that reaction. He was somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to the external world, standing with the specific interior quiet of a man who has arrived at the end of something he started alone. He heard a sound to his right and looked down. Chloe had come to stand beside him. She must have moved from the barrier at some point. He hadn't seen it happen. She was looking at the aircraft with her head tilted slightly in the way she had when she was concentrating. Her purple coat, the backpack she'd apparently never taken off. Without looking away from the aircraft, she reached over and put her hand in his. Her hand was small and warm and had a Band-Aid on the left index finger that he'd put on this morning after she'd caught it on something sharp while getting her breakfast. A small, daily domestic detail of the kind that made up the actual fabric of his life. He held her hand. The engines ran. The weather check came back from the tower at 10:18, ceiling at 4,000 feet, visibility 12 miles, wind calm, conditions favorable. Carver's voice came through Ethan's headset. "Carter, how do we look from your end?" Ethan did a final visual sweep. Engines, gear position, control surface positions, the dozen other checkpoints he'd run through so many times he could do them from somewhere below conscious thought. "Clean," he said. "You're good." "Copy that," Carver said. A brief pause. "Good work on this aircraft. I want you to know I don't say that as a formality." Ethan pressed his lips together for a moment. "Thank you, Ben." "Here we go." The ground crew cleared the immediate apron area. The wheel chocks came out. The Falcon X9 began to move under its own power for the first time in 6 years. Slow at first, the ground roll away from the apron toward the taxiway, and then steady, purposeful, the aircraft finding its geometry on the pavement the way aircraft always did, the slight nose-up attitude of a jet on the ground that was designed to be in the air. Ethan watched it taxi. Beside him, Chloe was very still. Her hand tightened slightly in his. At the hold short line for runway 21, Carver ran the final checks. Ethan could hear the radio traffic between the cockpit and the tower, the routine choreography of clearances and redbacks that sounded the same for this aircraft as for any other, which was in some ways the most extraordinary thing about it. The most extraordinary thing was the ordinariness of it. The aircraft was doing what aircraft did, the way it was designed to do from the beginning. The tower cleared the Falcon X9 for takeoff. Carver taxied onto runway 21 and stopped. The engines spooled up. The sound changed. Not in kind, but in degree. The turbofans building through the climb from idle to takeoff power. The frequency rising. The physical pressure of it reaching the people at the barrier even from this distance. Ethan felt it in his chest. He always felt large engines in his chest. It was one of the things about this work that he'd never stopped noticing. The brakes released. The Falcon X9 accelerated. It moved down runway 21 with the gathering speed of a machine that had been waiting 6 years to do exactly this. Not a dramatic acceleration, not a Hollywood takeoff, just the clean physics of an aircraft reaching rotation speed in the way aircraft did. Ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The landing gear absorbing the runway surface, and then not needing to absorb it anymore because the wings were generating lift and the ground was no longer the relevant fact. The nose lifted. There was a moment, one specific moment, where the main gear was still on the runway and the nose was up, and the aircraft was in the transition between two states of being, neither fully on the ground nor fully in the air. And in that moment, the runway was very quiet because everyone watching had stopped making sound without deciding to. The main gear left the runway. The Falcon X9 climbed. It climbed into the gray October sky over Duluth, Minnesota, on a cold Friday morning, and it climbed cleanly. The gear coming up as it should, the engine steady, the flight profile exactly what it should be for an aircraft performing its certification sequence, and the sound of it receding upward into the overcast was a specific sound that carried everything the past months had contained in it. Danny made a sound. He later described it as a professional observation about the engine note, but everyone who heard it knew it wasn't that. Some of the mechanics at the barrier were doing what Marcus had observed Danny doing. Not crying, technically, but having strong feelings about aviation that expressed themselves physically. One older man that Ethan didn't know by name had taken his cap off and was holding it against his chest. Marcus was standing very still with his hands in his pockets. Ethan watched the aircraft climb until it entered the cloud base and disappeared. For a moment there was just the sky and the sound of the engines, fading. Then the sound faded too. The runway was quiet. Chloe's hand was still in his. She was looking up at the place where the aircraft had been. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. It flew." "It flew," he said. She turned and looked at him. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and she had a Band-Aid on her finger from a small morning injury, and she had been calm about all of this from the beginning because she'd decided it was going to be okay. "I knew it would," she said simply. He looked down at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I know you did," he said finally. She turned back to watch the sky. He kept his eyes on her face for a moment longer. The specific face of his daughter, which he knew with the intimate completeness of 4 years of sole parenthood, every expression and every frequency of feeling, and then looked back at the sky, too. 17 minutes into the flight, the first radio contact from Carver came through on the general channel so the crowd at the barrier could hear. "Ironcrest ground. This is Falcon X9. Systems nominal across the board. She's flying clean." A brief pause. "Whoever worked on this aircraft, tell them it flies like it was built yesterday." The sound that came from the barrier was not organized and it was not quiet. Victoria Hale was standing 12 feet away from Ethan. He was aware of her without looking directly at her, aware of the stillness in her, the same quality of interior attention he'd noticed in the hangar. He glanced over. She was looking at the sky. She had the expression of someone who had arrived at a thought that was new and which they were going to need to sit with. Not an emotional expression. She didn't go to emotional easily, he understood that now. But something had moved in it. Something had shifted from the architectural control that was her default into something more direct and less defended. She felt him looking and turned. For a moment they just looked at each other across 12 feet of tarmac with the October sky above them and the sound of people still reacting somewhere behind them. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, delivered with the same directness she brought to everything. He knew she wasn't thanking him for the aircraft, not primarily. She was thanking him for something more difficult than the aircraft. "You moved fast when you had reason to," he said. Something in the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "You said that before." "It's still true." She looked back at the sky. "My first job out of business school," she said, not quite to him and not quite not to him. "I told myself the goal was to make decisions with clean information, perfect information. That the reason companies failed was noise, emotional noise, incomplete data, people with agendas." She paused. "I spent 10 years building a methodology for cutting through noise. And I walked into this company with a perfect methodology and a corrupted data set and made exactly the wrong call with complete confidence." She said it without self-pity, with the flat precision of someone reading back a lesson they were going to remember. Clean information isn't enough. You also have to know when the information itself has been compromised. Most people don't figure that out until it costs them something, Ethan said. What did it cost you? He thought about the $312, the $67, the $800 from his brother, the weeks of Chloe reading his face for weather, the night in the cockpit when he'd been afraid in a clear and physical way and had done the work anyway. "Less than it could have," he said. She studied him for a moment with the specific attention she gave to things she was trying to understand accurately. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Something louder, maybe. Most people who turn out to be right about something make sure you know about it." "I knew about it," he said. "That was enough." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I want to talk to you about your future at this company. Not today. Today isn't the day for it. But this week." "Okay," he said. She nodded once and moved away toward Sandra and the communications director, who had the look of people managing the practical aftermath of an event they'd need to characterize accurately for the press. Ethan looked down at Chloe, who had been following his conversation with the CEO with the focused peripheral attention of a child pretending not to pay attention. "She seems okay," Chloe said judiciously. "She is," Ethan said. "She talks like she's thinking while she's talking, like the words and the thinking are happening at the same time." "I think they are." Chloe considered this. "That's hard to do." "It is," he said. The Falcon X9 completed the first leg of its certification sequence and entered the return approach over the lake at 11:40. They heard it before they saw it. the engine note descending through the cloud base in the way that always came before the visual, and then the aircraft appearing below the overcast in the final approach configuration, gear down, flaps set, descending steadily toward runway 21. It wasn't dramatic. It was clean and precise. Carver's approach was exactly what a test pilot's approach looked like. The aircraft on glide slope, the rate of descent controlled, touching down at the numbers with the specific gentle authority of a well-executed landing. The tires chirped once on the runway. The thrust reversers deployed with their particular sound. The Falcon X9 rolled out and turned off the runway onto the taxiway, and the crowd at the barrier produced a sound that was different from the takeoff sound. The takeoff had been hope. This was confirmation. Marcus turned to Ethan and said 3 words. "That's 1 down," meaning 5 more certification flights to go. Meaning the work wasn't done yet, not technically. Meaning this was not the ending. This was the beginning of the ending, and Marcus wanted to be sure everyone understood the distinction. "That's 1 down," Ethan agreed. But they both knew, standing on that tarmac in the October cold, that the distinction didn't change the fact of what had just happened. The aircraft had flown. All the rest of it, the certification sequence, the paperwork, the formal process, was real and necessary, and also, in some essential way, secondary to the fact that was already established. The ghost had flown. As the aircraft taxied back toward the apron, Ethan became aware that people were moving toward him. Not in a rush, but in the way people move toward the center of something. Mechanics from the barrier, operations staff, Jerry Marsh with an expression that was doing several things at once, Danny, who arrived first because he'd been closest, and who grabbed Ethan's shoulder and said something that Ethan didn't fully hear because there was too much sound now, too many people and voices around him. He stood in the middle of it and was present with it, and also slightly outside it at the same time. The specific duality of being at the center of an event you had worked toward for months, but which, now that it was here, had a quality that didn't match any of the versions of it you'd imagined while working toward it. It was better and stranger and less cinematic and more real. Someone was taking photographs. He was aware of a camera pointed at him and looked away from it, which was instinct rather than strategy. Chloe was still beside him. She had let go of his hand at some point, when the crowd came, he thought, and was standing slightly to his left in her purple coat, looking around at all the people with the measured observation of someone taking inventory. "Dad," she said. She had to say it twice before he heard her over the noise. "Yeah, people are crying." He looked. She was right. Not many. 3, 4 mechanics he recognized from the line crew. At least one person he didn't know. Not dramatic crying. Just the kind that happened when something you didn't fully realize you cared about turned out to matter. "Yeah," he said. "Is that about the plane or about you?" He considered this seriously because she'd asked it seriously. Probably both, he said. She nodded. She seemed to find this satisfactory. The Falcon X9 completed its taxi to the apron, and the ground crew moved in with the chocks. Ben Carver appeared at the top of the air stairs a few minutes later and descended to the tarmac with the measured movement of a man post-flight, the particular physical state of someone whose nervous system is returning from high operational engagement to normal. He crossed toward Ethan through the crowd that parted for him naturally. He shook Ethan's hand. His grip was firm, and he made direct eye contact in the way of someone for whom that was a professional discipline. "Honest assessment," Ethan said. "How does she fly?" Carver thought about it for a moment. He was a man who thought before he answered, which Ethan respected. "She flies like she was designed to fly," he said. "Not perfect. We've got some handling notes for the envelope expansion flights that'll need attention. The stick force gradient in the high-speed regime needs calibration. Minor stuff." He paused. "But the foundation, the aircraft itself, what you've built back, it's solid, it's sound." He looked at the Falcon X9 on the apron. Whoever sabotaged it, they picked the wrong aircraft, or the wrong mechanic. "Wrong mechanic," Marcus said from somewhere behind Ethan's left shoulder. Carver glanced at him. "Agreed," he said simply. He moved away toward the debriefing station where Dr. Sung was waiting with her post-flight review checklist. Ethan watched him go and felt the crowd around him continuing to move and talk and react and be human in the way crowds were, and he stood in the middle of it in his flannel shirt with his daughter beside him and let it be what it was. He didn't try to make it more. He didn't try to make it less. The aircraft was real. The work was real. Everything that came next, the remaining certification flights, the formal investigation conclusion, the conversations with Victoria Hale about what his future at Ironcrest looked like, all the ordinary business of a life continuing forward. All of that was real too. He'd figure it out. He had a pattern. The remaining 5 certification flights happened over the next 2 weeks, and each one was quieter than the first. Not because they mattered less. They mattered enormously, each one expanding the aircraft's tested envelope, each one generating data that Dr. Sung and Ben Carver reviewed with the meticulous attention of people who understood that an aircraft is only as trustworthy as the sum of what it's been proven to do. But the crowd wasn't there for the second flight, or the third. The photographers weren't at the barrier. The operations staff who'd taken long lunch breaks to watch the first takeoff were back at their desks by the time the 4th flight rolled the aircraft out onto the apron in a light November rain. That was fine with Ethan. The first flight had been about proof. The ones that followed were about work, which was where he was most comfortable anyway. He and Marcus and Danny were present for every flight. They ran the pre-flight documentation, supported the ground crew, reviewed the post-flight data with Dr. Sung after each sequence. Ben Carver filed detailed handling notes after each flight, the stick force gradient issue they'd identified on the first flight, a minor asymmetry in the roll response at the upper end of the airspeed envelope, a fuel flow irregularity during one climb sequence that turned out to be a sensor calibration offset rather than an actual fuel system problem. Each note generated a task. Each task got done. By the 5th flight, Carver's post-flight debrief was noticeably shorter than the previous ones. By the 6th, the final full-envelope performance flight, flown on a clear Tuesday morning in the first week of November, his written assessment was 4 paragraphs and concluded with the statement that the aircraft performed within all design specifications and that he had no further handling concerns. Dr. Sung issued the airworthiness certification on Thursday morning. She handed Ethan the signed certificate in the hangar office with the same unadorned practicality she'd brought to every other aspect of the process and said, "The aircraft is certified. Everything from here is operational." "Thank you," Ethan said. "Thank yourself," she said. "I certified what you built." She picked up her bag. "One more thing." She paused at the door. "I've been doing independent inspections for 23 years. I've seen a lot of restoration work, a lot of aircraft pulled back from various states of neglect and damage." She considered what she was about to say with the care of someone who didn't give assessments loosely. "This is the best work I've evaluated that was done under the circumstances you were working under. I want that noted." She left before he could respond. That was her pattern, and he'd come to expect it. The statement delivered and the statement done, no lingering for reaction. He sat with it for a moment in the empty hangar office. Then he texted Marcus and Danny. "She's certified." Marcus responded 11 seconds later. "Good." Danny responded 4 seconds after that. "Let's go!" Ethan put his phone in his pocket and looked through the office window at the Falcon X9, which was sitting on the hangar floor in the same position it had occupied for 6 years, except that now it was different in every way that mattered. He thought about calling his brother in Denver. He thought about it and then did it, standing in the hangar office, because some things didn't need to wait for a better moment. His brother answered on the second ring. "Hey," his brother said. "She's certified," Ethan said. A pause. His brother's voice, when it came back, had a quality that Ethan recognized from the phone call when he'd borrowed the money. The quality of someone choosing not to say the larger thing because the smaller thing was more respectful. "Yeah?" his brother said. "Yeah." "That's good, man. That's really good. I'll pay you back the rest of the—" "Ethan, stop." "I will, though. I know you will. That's not what I'm saying." Another pause. "I'm saying stop making it about money for 1 minute. You did the thing." Ethan looked at the aircraft. "Yeah," he said. "I did the thing." They talked for 12 minutes, which was longer than their usual calls. It was a good conversation, not emotional in the dramatic sense, just two brothers catching up in a way that had some actual weight to it for once. His brother asked about Chloe. Ethan told him about the science museum, the drawing she'd made for his office, the Band-Aid on the finger the morning of the first flight. His brother laughed at the Band-Aid detail. "She sounds like Sarah," his brother said. He said it carefully, the way you said things that might hurt. "Yeah," Ethan said. She does. It didn't hurt. Or it did, but it was the good kind. The kind that confirmed something was real rather than the kind that took something away. He'd gotten better at distinguishing between the two. The meeting with Victoria Hale happened the following Monday. Not in the boardroom. She'd said she wanted to meet in her office, which was on the 4th floor and which Ethan had never been in before. It was a smaller space than he expected for a CEO's office, with the same wall of windows facing the tarmac, but without the designed for authority quality of the boardroom. There was a desk with actual work on it, papers and a laptop and a coffee cup, and 2 chairs across from it that faced each other in a way that suggested conversation rather than presentation. She was at the desk when he arrived and stood when he came in, which he hadn't expected. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee?" "I'm fine," he said. She sat. He sat. She had a folder open on the desk but didn't look at it immediately. "The OIG investigation is expected to produce indictments within the next 60 days, she said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has been clear that the evidence package is strong. Cole's attorney is already negotiating, which means they know the case is solid." She paused. "The civil litigation against Vantage Aerosystems will take longer. Years, probably." "I know. Ironcrest stock has recovered most of what it lost over the 18 months of the scheme. It'll take time to fully normalize, but the trajectory is positive." She said this the way she said most things, as information, not boasting. "The board voted last week to issue a public statement about the investigation and the aircraft restoration. It was released Friday." "I saw it," he said. "There was a version that was going to mention you by name more prominently," she said. "I made the call to keep it modest in that respect. I thought I'd ask you whether that was the right call." He considered it. "It was the right call," he said. "The aircraft is the story, not me." She looked at him steadily. "Most people in your position would disagree with that." "Most people in my position weren't doing it to be in the story," he said. She was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet she used when she was deciding how direct to be, and how she was going to structure what came next. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Director of Aircraft Integrity. It's a new role. We're creating it specifically. The mandate is independent oversight of all maintenance documentation and aircraft systems assessment across the Ironcrest fleet. Reports directly to the board, not through operational management." She paused. "The salary is significantly different from what you're currently earning." Ethan sat with this. He'd had some version of this conversation in his head, imagined it, worked through it, enough times over the past weeks that he wasn't surprised by the offer. He was surprised by the specific structure of it, the reporting line to the board rather than through operations, which was either a very deliberate design or an accident, and he suspected strongly it was the former. "There are 3 things," he said. Something moved in her expression. Not quite amusement, but its functional neighbor. "Go ahead," she said. "Full healthcare coverage for the entire maintenance staff. Not just mechanics, all hourly workers at every facility. What they have now has gaps that I know about because I lived in those gaps." He'd checked after the suspension when he was navigating his own insurance situation. What he found was that Ironcrest's employee health coverage had a structure that looked adequate from above and was insufficient in practice for the people most likely to need it. "Fix it." She wrote something. "Okay. Next. A scholarship fund for employees' children. Doesn't have to be large to start. It can grow. But it needs to exist and it needs to be funded consistently, not as a one-time thing." He thought about what this kind of thing would have meant when he was trying to figure out how Chloe was going to get to college on a mechanic's salary. He thought about the other people in the facility who were running the same calculation. Victoria was writing again. "Okay, Marcus Webb and Danny Reyes get promoted. Marcus to lead maintenance supervisor with the salary that reflects what he actually does rather than the title they've been giving him. Danny to senior mechanic with a clear path to the next level." He paused. "They did this work. They did it when they had every reason not to. That gets recognized on paper, not just verbally." She looked up from her writing. "Is that it?" "That's it." She closed the folder. "The healthcare restructuring will take time to implement. There are contract timelines involved, but I'll commit to a 60-day plan." She looked at him directly. "The scholarship fund and the promotions can happen within 2 weeks. 60 days on the healthcare is acceptable if it's a real plan, not a placeholder." I don't make placeholder commitments, she said. Her voice had a slight edge. Not hostile, just the edge of someone who found the implication mildly insulting. He understood. He left it. Then yes, he said, I'll take the position. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. One question, she said. She hadn't let go of the handshake yet, which he found slightly unusual. Why those 3 conditions? You could have asked for more. He thought about it honestly. Because those 3 things are what I would have needed. They're what the people I work with need. I know what they look like from the inside. He paused. Everything else I asked for, the salary, whatever, that's just between you and me. But those 3 things affect other people who aren't in this room. So those are the ones that matter. She released his hand. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd seen before but understood better now. The expression of someone recalibrating a model they'd been running with incomplete variables. You know, she said, most people who negotiate a job offer think about what they're getting. I thought about what I'm getting, he said. I just thought about the other things first. She almost smiled. This time it made it a little further than the corner of her mouth. I'll have the paperwork drawn up by Wednesday, she said. He took the stairs instead of the elevator on the way out because the stairs took him past the 2nd floor where the maintenance department's main workspace was, and he wanted to walk through it. It was midday and the floor was active. People at workstations, the sound of a printer somewhere, 2 technicians in the corridor having a conversation about a parts order that had been delayed. Nobody noticed him particularly. He was just a person walking through a floor he'd walked through 100 times before. He walked through it slowly and thought about what it meant to know a place. Not in the abstract, specifically. The specific weight of knowing that the printer near the east wall jammed if you used the heavy paper stock. Knowing that the workstation near the window got direct afternoon sun that made the screen unreadable from 2 to 4. Knowing that Marcus kept his personal toolkit in the 3rd cabinet from the left because the 2nd cabinet had a drawer that stuck. He was going to be director of aircraft integrity. He was going to have a different office, different responsibilities, a different relationship to this floor and this building. He was going to have to learn to operate at a level where the work was more abstract, more systemic, more about the structure of how things were done rather than the immediate physical fact of doing them. He was going to miss the immediate physical fact of doing them. He knew that already. But he was going to be able to make sure that what happened to the Falcon X9, the slow, deliberate corruption of a system that nobody was watching carefully enough, was harder to do the next time. That was worth something. That was worth the abstraction. He kept walking. The conversation with Marcus happened that afternoon in the hangar. Ethan told him about the promotion straight. No preamble, just the information. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was seated on a workbench with a cup of coffee, which was his default position for end-of-day conversations. He looked at the middle distance and processed this in the way he processed most things, which was internally and without performance. Supervisor, he said. Lead maintenance supervisor. The salary's being restructured to match. Another pause. And Reyes? Senior mechanic, clear advancement track. Marcus looked at his coffee. What about you? I took a new position, director of aircraft integrity. Marcus looked up at that. Not surprised exactly. More like confirming something he'd suspected. Reports to who? The board. A long pause. That's important, Marcus said. He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it as an assessment, the way he assessed everything, factually, with precision. I know, Ethan said. You're going to have to learn a different kind of work. I know that too. Marcus drank his coffee, set the cup down. You're going to be bad at the political part for a while. Probably. You'll figure it out. He said it the same way he said everything, without decoration, without warmth added for comfort, which was, in Marcus's language, the warmest thing he could say. Thank you, Ethan said. He meant it for more than the coffee conversation, and both of them knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly, because that was also the language they'd developed. Marcus picked up his cup again. Tell Reyes tomorrow morning he's going to make noise about it. I know. That's fine. Let him make noise. I will. He told Danny the next morning. Danny made noise about it for approximately 90 seconds. The good kind of noise, loud and uncontrolled and completely sincere, and then immediately started planning what he was going to tell his mother, who had apparently been following the Ironcrest situation with the focused intensity of someone with strong opinions about her son's career trajectory. "She's going to lose her mind," Danny said. "In a good way. Mostly." "Mostly?" Ethan said. "She's going to want you to come to dinner," Danny said. "Fair warning. She feeds people when she's proud of someone, and she's going to be proud of both of us." He paused. "You should come. She makes pozole." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Okay." "Really?" "Really." Danny looked at him with the expression of someone who'd expected a softer no and had received an actual yes. "Okay," he said, slightly recalibrating. "Good. I'll tell her. She's going to make a lot of food." "That's fine," Ethan said. The federal indictments came down 43 days after the airworthiness certification. Raymond Cole was charged with wire fraud, corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and 3 counts of knowingly introducing unauthorized components into certified aircraft systems, the last category carrying the heaviest potential penalties under aviation law. His external contact at Vantage Aerosystems was charged separately. 2 additional individuals inside Ironcrest's IT infrastructure were named in a related filing. The question mark that had been on Ethan's corkboard, the second person whose involvement he'd suspected, turned out to be 2 people: a systems administrator who'd been providing database access and a mid-level operations analyst who'd been managing the documentation alterations. 4 people. Total. A small number for the scale of what they'd done. Ethan read about the indictments in a news alert on his phone while he was in a budget meeting in his new role, which was the specific irony of the new job. Things happened that he'd spent months working toward, and they happened while he was in budget meetings. He read the alert under the edge of the conference table, which was something he'd told himself he wouldn't do, and which he did anyway. He texted Patricia Okonkwo after the meeting, saw the indictments. "Thank you for everything you did." She responded, "You did the work. I filed the paperwork. Don't confuse the two." And then a minute later, "Call me if you need anything during the trial phase. There will likely be depositions." There were. 4 months later, Ethan gave a formal deposition to the U.S. Attorney's Office that lasted 3 hours and covered the documentation analysis, the avionics component identification, the fuel system tampering, and the provenance research. He gave it clearly and precisely, and without the emotional emphasis that would have been understandable but which would not have served the purpose. The purpose was accuracy. He was accurate. Cole's attorney entered a plea agreement 6 weeks after the deposition. The terms of the agreement were not public, but Patricia told Ethan what she could, which was enough for him to understand that Cole was not going to be in a position to do this again for a very long time. Ethan did not feel triumphant about this. He felt, if he was honest, tired in a way that was only now becoming fully apparent. The specific exhaustion that comes after adrenaline has been the structural support of your life for an extended period and has finally stopped being necessary. He was sleeping better, which should have felt unambiguously good, and mostly did, except that the sleep came with dreams that were occasionally vivid and not always straightforward, the kind that processed things at night that he didn't have time to process during the day. He talked to a therapist, not dramatically. He found a therapist who had office hours on Thursday evenings, made an appointment, went, and kept going because it turned out to be useful in the specific way that things you've been avoiding are often useful once you stop avoiding them. He told very few people about the therapy. Mrs. Kowalski knew because she was perceptive and because he'd mentioned the Thursday evenings and she'd put it together. She didn't say anything about it except once, obliquely, when she said, "Good things take maintenance too, you know, not just airplanes." He'd said yes, and she'd handed him the soup she'd made, and that was the whole conversation. Chloe knew something was different about Thursday evenings, but had filed it in the category of adult things that weren't her business and which she therefore treated with dignified indifference. This was, Ethan thought, a very mature response from a 9-year-old, and he was both grateful for it and slightly worried by it, which was the texture of parenthood in general, gratitude and worry in constant adjacency. One Thursday evening in February, when he picked Chloe up from Mrs. Kowalski's after his session, she was unusually quiet on the drive home. Not unhappy, just quiet in a specific way that he recognized as processing. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah." A pause. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Do you miss Mom?" He drove for a moment before answering. The road was wet from earlier rain, and the headlights were doing the thing they did in wet conditions where every surface had its own light. "Every day," he said. "Me too." She was looking out the window. "Mrs. Kowalski says that missing someone means they were real, like it's proof." "Mrs. Kowalski is wise," Ethan said. "I told Emma about Mom once," Chloe said. "She said she was sorry, and I said it was okay, but it's not okay. It's how it is." She frowned slightly, trying to find the right words. "Is that the same thing as okay?" He thought about this carefully, because she was asking it carefully. "I think it's a different category," he said. "Okay means things are good. What you're describing is more like you've made peace with something being true even when you wish it wasn't. That's not the same as okay. It's more like strong." She considered this for the rest of the drive. When they got home and she was getting ready for bed, she said from the bathroom while brushing her teeth, "Dad, I think you're strong too, in case you didn't know." He stood in the hallway. "Thanks, Bug," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Very matter of fact. He stood in the hallway after she'd gone to bed, in the apartment with the corkboard that he'd finally taken down last month and replaced with a photograph Chloe had taken of the Falcon X9 on the tarmac. Slightly crooked, the horizon not quite level, the aircraft gray against the sky. It was a better thing to have on the wall. He thought about strength in the way Chloe had used it. Not as a heroic category, not as an absence of fear or difficulty, but as something more pedestrian and more actual. The strength of continuing, of doing the next thing that needed to be done, of not quitting when quitting would have been understandable. He thought about the people who had called the Falcon X9 a dead machine and had believed it, and the people who had called it that and known it wasn't, and had counted on that belief spreading. He thought about the distance between those two groups and how that distance was the distance between a mistake and a crime. The distance between being wrong and choosing to be wrong because it was profitable. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria in her office. "I just thought about the other things first." He'd meant it simply when he said it, but he'd thought about it since with more complexity because it turned out to be less simple than it sounded. Thinking about the other things first was not a virtue he'd chosen or a character trait he'd cultivated. It was a consequence of a specific life, of raising Chloe alone, of losing Sarah without warning, of learning at 30 that the world didn't hold still for you to be ready for it. When the ground shifted under you, you learned pretty quickly that you could either wait for it to stabilize or start building on what was actually there. He'd built on what was actually there. He turned off the kitchen light and looked at the photograph on the wall for a moment in the dark. The Falcon X9 on the tarmac, slightly crooked, real. He went to bed. The first time the Falcon X9 flew a commercial route, it was a Tuesday morning in March, 8 months after Ethan had stood in front of the boardroom and said that aircraft didn't fail on its own. The route was a short regional hop. Duluth to Minneapolis, 45 minutes in the air, 41 passengers, and a full crew. An ordinary flight. The kind that happened dozens of times every day at airports across the country without anyone marking them as significant. Ethan was not on that flight. He was in his office on the 4th floor of the main building, reviewing documentation for a fleet-wide inspection program he was implementing. The first major initiative of his new role. A systematic review of maintenance records across all active Ironcrest aircraft, designed to find exactly the kind of inconsistencies he'd found in the Falcon X9. Not because he expected to find more sabotage, because the absence of rigorous oversight was the condition that made sabotage possible in the first place. And he was going to remove that condition. It was detailed, unglamorous work. He was mostly good at it, and occasionally frustrated by the bureaucratic resistance that institutional change always generated. And he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, how to navigate the organizational landscape of a senior role that involved more conversations and fewer tangible objects than his previous work. Marcus had been right about the political part being difficult. He was working on it. He got a text at 11:40 from Danny, who had somehow obtained the flight tracking data for the aircraft. She just landed in MSP, on time. 41 passengers. Ethan looked at his phone for a moment. He typed back, "Good." Danny responded immediately. "That's it? Good?" Ethan typed, "It's a good word." 3 dots. Then, "You're impossible." A pause. Then, "Marcus says the same thing BTW." He set his phone down and looked at the wall of his office, which had Chloe's crooked photograph of the aircraft in it. He'd moved it here from the apartment because it belonged here, in the place where the work continued, in the place where the question of what the aircraft was and what it could do had been answered and was now being built on. The aircraft was flying a Tuesday morning route. 41 people were arriving in Minneapolis 8 minutes ahead of schedule. The Falcon X9 was not a ghost anymore. It was not an abandoned machine in a cold hangar being used by people who wanted it forgotten. It was a working aircraft doing the thing it was built to do, carrying people from one place to another with the clean, unceremonious reliability that was the entire point. That was the whole point. Not the drama of the restoration, not the investigation, not the boardroom moment or the runway crowd. The point was this Tuesday morning. The point was 41 ordinary people who boarded an ordinary flight and arrived safely where they were going without knowing or needing to know any of the history of the machine that carried them. Ethan understood this clearly. He'd understood it from the beginning, in some form, though he hadn't had the language for it back when he was reading maintenance files alone in his truck at lunch. The record mattered. If the record was wrong, you fixed it. Not because you were building toward a dramatic moment. The dramatic moments came, or they didn't, and they weren't the point. But because the thing built on a false record would eventually fail in ways that reached into the lives of people who trusted the record to be accurate. 41 people on a Tuesday morning trusting that the aircraft they were on had been maintained correctly, documented honestly, repaired with care. That was what was at stake. Not his job, not his pride, not the vindication of a level 2 mechanic standing up in a boardroom. Those things were real, but they were incidental. The actual stakes were the 41 people and everyone after them. He went back to the fleet documentation review. That evening, he picked Chloe up from school. She came out in the purple coat. She had a new one this year, slightly darker than the old one, because she'd grown and the old one was genuinely too small now, which she'd been pragmatic about in the way she was pragmatic about most things. She had her backpack on, and her hair was doing something complicated, and she was carrying a paper that she handed to him immediately. "My essay," she said. "I got it back." Mr. Haddad wrote something at the bottom. He took the paper. It was titled, "A Person I Admire" at the top in her handwriting, and at the bottom, in red pen, Mr. Haddad had written, "Excellent work, Chloe. Your father sounds like exactly the kind of person worth writing about." Ethan read it twice. "Good essay?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "I mostly wrote about how you didn't quit even when it was hard, and about how you always fix things instead of just saying they're broken." She considered. "Also, I wrote about how you make the pasta sauce." Mr. Haddad seemed confused about why that was in there, but I think it's relevant. "It's relevant," he said. "I know." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. She watched him do this with the expression of someone whose assessment of the situation has been confirmed. They walked to the truck. The Duluth evening was cold and clear. February had been brutal, and March was making its case slowly, not ready to be warm but willing to be less cold than it had been. The airport was visible in the middle distance, the navigation lights of a departing aircraft climbing out over the lake. Chloe looked at the aircraft as they walked. "Is that ours?" she asked. She'd developed a habit of calling Ironcrest aircraft ours since the restoration, which Ethan found both touching and slightly complicated. "Probably," he said. "Could be the regional out of Chicago, too." She watched it climb until the navigation lights were small and distinct against the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what you said when the airplane flew." She was still looking at the sky. "You said you didn't give up. That's what you said when I said you saved them." "Yeah. But that's the same thing as saving them. If you'd given up, the airplane never flies. All those people don't get where they're going." She finally looked at him. "So not giving up is the same as doing something. It's not less than doing something." He looked at her. She was 9 years old, and she was standing in a parking lot in a purple coat, explaining to him something that he understood in his bones, but had never quite organized into language. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. She said it the way she said most things she was certain about, without showing off, just stating fact. "Can we get pizza?" "It's not Thursday," he said. "Special occasion." "What's the occasion?" She thought about it for a moment. "The airplane flying, I guess, or the essay, or just March." She shrugged slightly. "We don't need a reason. We just need pizza. He opened the truck door for her. Yeah, he said. Okay, pizza.
She climbed in. He went around to the driver's side, got in, started the engine. The Silverado had 197,000 miles on it now. The windshield crack had been joined by a smaller secondary crack that he was monitoring with the specific pragmatic attention he gave to everything that was functional but declining. He'd fix it eventually. When it was the thing most in need of fixing. The pine tree air freshener was still there. Still didn't smell like pine. Chloe had asked him once more a few months ago if he wanted to replace it, and he'd said no, and she'd looked at it for a moment and said, okay, with the understanding of someone who didn't need the reason explained. He backed out of the school parking lot and pulled onto the road. The aircraft he'd watched take off was a small light now, moving steadily south over the lake, doing exactly what it was designed to do. He drove. Beside him, Chloe was already talking. Something about Mr. Haddad's confused reaction to the pasta sauce paragraph, which she found unjustifiably baffling, and was prepared to defend at length. He listened. The road was wet from the day's earlier snow, and the headlights made the wet pavement do the thing with the reflected light that it always did. Ordinary and specific. The small, navigated facts of an evening going home. This was what remained after the investigations and the certifications and the indictments and the boardroom moments. Not those things. Those were finished or finishing, belonging now to the past that had shaped the present, rather than the present itself. What remained was this: a drive home through a March evening, a daughter describing a paragraph that needed defending, a truck with 197,000 miles, and a non-pine air freshener, and somewhere south over the lake, an aircraft carrying people where they needed to go. Ethan Carter had not saved anyone in the way that stories sometimes described saving. He had done the specific work that the situation required. He had read documents that needed reading, found the thing that needed finding, and refused to accept a false version of something he could see was false. That was not heroism. That was just paying attention, doing the job, not quitting when the ground shifted. It turned out that was enough. In fact, it turned out that was most of it.